The saloon fell silent the moment Elias Ward's fist hit the wall. For 3 months, the mail-order husband hadn't spoken more than a dozen words. Margaret Kane's neighbors called him the mute, whispered he was simple, wondered why a desperate widow would settle for such a ghost of a man. But when Clint Harlow spat on her family name, called her cursed, called her pathetic, something ancient and terrible woke behind Elias's quiet eyes. Turns out silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's just a dam waiting to break. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The afternoon sun beat down merciless on Silverb's single dirt road, turning the Wyoming dust into a haze that hung in the air like smoke. Margaret Kane stood on the train platform with her hands clasped so tight her knuckles had gone white, watching the iron beast roll toward her with a screech of brakes that set her teeth on edge. September 1885, and she was about to meet the man she'd married through letters, a stranger she'd agreed to spend her life with, because the alternative was losing everything. She was 32 years old, in a town like Silver Bend that made her practically ancient for remarrying. Her first husband, Thomas, had been dead 2 years, thrown from a horse and gone before the doctor could even arrive. The ranch he'd left her was 200 acres of stubborn Wyoming earth, and the bank didn't care how hard she worked it. Without a man's name on the deed, without a husband to legitimize her claim, she had 6 months before they'd take it all. So she'd done what desperate women did. She'd placed an advertisement in the matrimonial news. Widow, 32, seeking capable husband for working ranch. Must be sober, honest, and willing to build a life in Wyoming territory. Romance less important than reliability. She'd gotten 4 responses. 3 of them had been so poorly spelled she doubted the men could read their own writing. But the 4th letter had been different. "Ma'am," it had said, "I'm not much for words, but I know horses, cattle, and hard work. Lost my family in Kansas, looking for a new start and a reason to stay in one place. If you'll have me, I'll do right by you and your land. Elias Ward." Something about that letter, its brevity, its honesty, had settled her decision. They'd exchanged 3 more letters, each of his shorter than the last, before she'd sent him the train fare. And now here she stood, seconds away from meeting the man who'd be sharing her name, her home, her bed. The train doors opened with a groan of metal. Passengers began to disembark. A family with crying children, a salesman with his sample case, an older woman in a purple hat. Margaret scanned each face, her heart hammering harder with each passing second. Then she saw him. Tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that looked like they'd been carved from the same granite as the mountains. He wore a battered grey coat that had seen better years, dark trousers tucked into worn boots. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face until he reached the platform and finally looked up. Their eyes met. Margaret's breath caught. He wasn't handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too weathered, too marked by sun and hardship. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, pale against tanned skin. His jaw was dark with several days' stubble, but his eyes, Lord, his eyes were the color of winter storms, grey and deep, and holding something she couldn't quite name. Sorrow, maybe, or secrets. He walked toward her with a measured stride, removed his hat and nodded once. That was it. No words, no greeting. Margaret swallowed hard. "Mr. Ward." Another nod. "I'm Margaret Kane." I'm your," she faltered, heat rising in her cheeks. "How exactly did you introduce yourself to the man you'd married by proxy 2 weeks ago?" He seemed to understand her struggle. The corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile, and he extended his hand. His handshake was firm, his palm calloused and warm. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. He was older than she'd expected. Maybe 40, maybe more. "Do you have bags?" she asked. He turned and picked up a single worn canvas rucksack from the platform. Everything he owned in the world, apparently. "Right. Well, the wagon's this way." She led him through town, acutely aware of the eyes tracking their progress. Mrs. Henderson watching from the mercantile window. Old Pete Wilson pausing in his sweeping to stare. The Kowalski twins grinning from the steps of the saloon. By nightfall, every soul in Silverbend would know that Margaret Kane's mail-order husband had finally arrived. Let them look, she thought, lifting her chin. Let them whisper all they wanted. She'd kept her ranch for 2 years alone, and she'd keep it 40 more with this silent stranger beside her. The wagon ride out to the ranch took 30 minutes. Margaret filled the silence by talking about the ranch, about the cattle, about the fence line that needed mending and the well that was running dry. Elias sat beside her, his hands resting on his knees, and listened. That's what unnerved her most. He wasn't just quiet, he was listening, really listening, in a way most men never did. Every time she glanced at him, she found his attention fixed on her face, taking in every word. "I should tell you," she said as the ranch house came into view. "People in town can be unkind. They talk about me being widowed, about me advertising for a husband. They think I'm desperate." Elias looked at her, then really looked, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was low and rough, like it hadn't been used much. "Are you?" The question was so direct it shocked her into honesty. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Good. Desperate means you won't quit easy." That was all he said for the rest of the journey. The ranch house was modest. 2 rooms, a kitchen that opened onto a small parlor, a bedroom separated by a curtain Margaret had sewn herself. She'd tried to make it presentable, scrubbed the floors until her back ached, put fresh wild flowers in a jar on the table. Now, seeing it through a stranger's eyes, she felt the weight of how small her life had become. "It's not much," she said, setting her bonnet on the hook by the door. Elias walked through slowly, taking in the wood stove, the rough hewn table, the window that looked out over the grazing land. He ran his hand along the doorframe, checking the construction, she realized, testing its strength. "It's solid," he said finally. "Good bones." Coming from him, it sounded like high praise. She'd prepared supper before leaving for town, stew that had been simmering all day. Bread she'd baked that morning. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons against bowls. Margaret searched for something to say, some way to bridge the vast quiet between them, but everything that came to mind seemed foolish. Finally, she set down her spoon. "You're a quiet one." Elias looked up from his bowl. For a long moment, he just studied her face. Then slowly he smiled. Not much, just a slight curve of his mouth, but it softened his whole face. He didn't deny it. After supper, he insisted on washing the dishes. Margaret watched him work with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. His movements were precise, economical, nothing wasted. "I should show you where you'll sleep," she said when he'd finished. Something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, maybe, or concern. "I made up a bedroll in the barn," she added quickly. I mean, we're married legally, but we don't know each other. I didn't presume." The relief in his eyes was unmistakable. He nodded, and for the first time she saw something like gratitude there. "Thank you," he said quietly. Those 2 words cost him something. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the deliberate care with which he shaped each syllable. This was a man who rationed his words like water in a drought. She walked him out to the barn, showed him where she'd laid out blankets and a pillow. The space was clean and smelled of hay and leather. In the nearest stall, her mare, Bessie, lifted her head and whickered softly. Elias went to the horse immediately, extending his hand. Bessie, who'd been skittish around everyone since Thomas died, walked right up to him and nuzzled his palm. "She likes you," Margaret said, surprised. Elias stroked the mare's nose with unexpected gentleness. "Animals know," he murmured. Then, seeming to realize he'd spoken aloud, he stepped back. Margaret lingered in the barn doorway, suddenly reluctant to leave. "Mr. Ward, Elias." His voice was soft but firm. "Elias," she corrected. "I want you to know. I'll try to be a good wife, in whatever way you need." He turned to face her fully, and in the lamplight his eyes were impossibly sad. "Just need you to be honest, Mom. Had enough of lies to last 2 lifetimes. There was a story there, a deep one, marked by pain. But she didn't pry. I can do that, and please call me Margaret." He nodded once. Margaret. The way he said her name, careful, respectful, made something flutter in her chest. She wasn't used to being spoken to like something valuable. That night she lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into darkness. And from the barn, so faint she almost missed it, came the sound of a harmonica. The melody was mournful and beautiful, each note aching with things unsaid. She fell asleep to that music, and dreamed of winter storms and quiet men who carried their pain like stones in their pockets. The next morning, Margaret woke to find Elias had already been up for hours. The fence she'd mentioned needing repair fixed. The well, she'd said, was running low. He'd cleaned the filter and checked the pump. By the time she'd made breakfast, he'd done more work than she usually managed in 2 days. "You must have started before dawn," she said, pouring him coffee. He accepted the cup with a nod, wrapping his large hands around it. She noticed his knuckles were scarred, the kind of marks that came from hard fighting or harder work. They fell into a routine over the following weeks. Elias worked from sunrise to sunset, never complaining, never asking for thanks. Margaret cooked and managed the household accounts, tried to keep up with the endless demands of ranch life. They spoke rarely, practical conversations about cattle prices and weather and which fields needed rotating, but gradually she began to notice things about him. The way he always made sure the horses were fed before he ate, how he never wasted anything. Every scrap of leather, every bent nail got saved and repurposed. The care he took with tools, cleaning and oiling them each night before bed. And that harmonica playing every evening sitting on the porch in the dark. She never asked him to stop, though the music made her chest ache. There was too much loneliness in those notes, too much loss. Town was harder. Their first Sunday at church together, Margaret felt every eye in the congregation tracking their movements. She and Elias sat in the back pew, her in her best dress, him in a clean shirt she'd pressed that morning. Reverend Michaels preached about faith and perseverance, but Margaret barely heard a word. She was too aware of the whispers behind gloved hands, the assessing looks from women who'd known her since childhood. After service, Clara Morrison cornered her on the church steps. Clara had been in Margaret's schoolroom 20 years ago, had married well to the owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties. Now she smiled with practiced sympathy. "Margaret, dear, I heard you'd acquired a husband." Her eyes drifted to where Elias stood by the wagon, his hat pulled low. "How resourceful of you." The word acquired stung like she'd meant it to. Margaret forced a smile. "Elias is a good man." "I'm sure," Clara said, her tone suggesting she was sure of nothing of the sort. "Though he seems awfully quiet." "Is he simple?" "My herald says he saw him in town, and the man barely grunted." Heat flooded Margaret's face. "He's not simple. He's just not a gossip." Clara's smile sharpened. "Of course not. Well, I do hope he works out for you, dear. Heaven knows you couldn't afford to be particular." She swept away before Margaret could respond, leaving poison in her wake. Elias was helping her into the wagon when she finally found her voice again. "I apologize for that for Clara. She's cruel," Elias said quietly. His jaw was set hard. "And scared?" Margaret blinked. "Scared women like that." He gathered the reins, his movements controlled. "They're scared of anything they can't control. You scare her." It was the longest speech she'd heard from him, and the insight surprised her. She studied his profile as he guided the horses onto the road home. "You don't talk much," she said. "But you notice everything, don't you?" The corner of his mouth lifted. "Learned young that listening tells you more than talking." "Where did you learn that?" His smile faded. "Kansas." "Before?" "Before what?" But he'd shut down again, his face going carefully blank, and she knew better than to push. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew worse. At the mercantile, she'd hear them pause when she walked in, then resume once she'd moved to the next aisle. That mail order man of hers, quiet as a grave, probably can't read. What kind of woman has to order a husband like you'd order a plow? Margaret tried to ignore it. She'd lived with gossip before. When Thomas died, half the town had whispered she'd driven him to recklessness with her sharp tongue and managing ways. She could handle small minds and smaller hearts. But it bothered Elias. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes when they went to town, in the way his hands would curl into fists and then slowly relax. He never responded to the comments, not even when drunk ranch hands made loud remarks about mail-order goods being inferior quality. He'd just keep walking, his face impassive. Only his eyes betrayed him. They'd go cold and distant, like he was somewhere else entirely. One evening, about 6 weeks after his arrival, Margaret found him in the barn later than usual. He was sitting on a hay bale, his harmonica, silent in his hands, staring at nothing. "Elias," she approached carefully. "Supper's ready." He didn't move. "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" "Sending for me." He looked up at her then, and the vulnerability in his face made her throat tight. Marrying a man sight unseen, bringing someone into your life who makes folks talk worse about you than they already did. Margaret sat down beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. People were already talking. "At least now I have help with the ranch." "That all I am? Help?" The question hung between them. Margaret thought about the past 6 weeks, the way he'd fixed everything that was broken, the way he gentled the horses, the way he'd started leaving wild flowers on the kitchen table even though he never mentioned it, the way her house felt less empty with him in it. "No," she said quietly, "you're not just help." He was silent for a long moment. "Then I had a family once in Kansas, a wife, a son." Margaret's breath caught. He'd never mentioned them. Not in his letters, not in all their weeks together. "What happened?" she asked gently. "Raiders. During the war, the little wars nobody talks about over land and water and old grudges. They came at night." His voice was flat, drained of emotion. "I was working late in the fields. By the time I got back to the house, he didn't finish. He didn't need to." "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. "I tracked them down, all of them." His hands tightened on the harmonica. "I was good at tracking, good at fighting. Too good." By the time I was done, he swallowed hard. "I swore I'd never raise my hand in anger again, never let that rage control me." Now his silence made terrible sense, a man holding himself so carefully in check, afraid of what might spill out if he spoke too freely. "That's why you don't talk much," she said. "You're afraid of losing control." "Every word's a risk," he admitted. "Every conversation's a chance I'll slip, say something I shouldn't, let someone see." He stopped, shook his head, easier to stay quiet. Margaret reached over and gently took his hand. His fingers were rough and scarred, strong enough to hurt, but holding hers with infinite care. "Elias, you're not the man you were then. I see how you are with the animals, with me. You're gentle." "Gentleness is just controlled violence," he said bitterly. "No." She squeezed his hand. "Gentleness is a choice, and you make that choice every single day." He looked at her then, really looked like he was seeing her for the first time. Something in his face shifted, softened. "You're a good woman, Margaret Kane. We're partners now," she said. "You don't have to carry everything alone anymore." That night, the harmonica music was different. Still sad, but threaded through with something else, something that might have been hope. October came with cold winds and early frost. The cattle needed moving to lower pasture. The barn needed reinforcing before winter storms hit. Elias worked like a man possessed, as if staying busy could keep his demons at bay. Margaret worked beside him when she could, learning to see the ranch through his eyes. What needed doing now versus what could wait, how to read weather patterns in the behavior of animals. They were becoming a team. She'd start a sentence and he'd finish it. He'd look at a fence and she'd already have the tools he needed. Small synchronicities that grew larger with each passing day. But in town, the whispers continued. The widow and her mute heard he don't even sleep in the house. What kind of marriage is that? Margaret tried not to let it affect her, but she saw how Elias's shoulders would tighten when they walked past groups of men outside the saloon, how his jaw would clench when women fell silent at their approach. The breaking point came on a cold afternoon in late October. Margaret had gone to town alone to trade eggs for supplies. Elias was working on the north fence line and had insisted she take the easy trip. She'd just finished loading the wagon when she heard the commotion from the saloon. Loud laughter, rough voices raised in drunken confidence. Cain, like the cursed one in the Bible. She froze, her hand on the wagon rail. That widow thinks she's too good for honest men, has to send away for a husband like he's a piece of furniture. Mail order man. Betty, don't even. Margaret forced herself to keep moving, to ignore them. She'd heard worse. She could handle this. But then she heard the scrape of boots on the wooden sidewalk behind her, and Clint Harlow's voice thick with whiskey and malice. "Afternoon, Mrs. Kane? Or should I say, Mrs. Ghost, since nobody's ever heard your husband speak a full sentence." She turned to face him. Clint was the youngest son of the Harlow Ranch, spoiled and mean, with a face flushed red from drinking. Behind him, three of his friends grinned like wolves. "Leave me alone, Clint." "Oh, don't be like that. We're just curious about your new acquisition. What's it like being married to a man who probably can't even—" "That's enough." Margaret's voice was still drunk. "Go home. I'm drunk." Clint laughed, a harsh bark that made people stop and stare. "Lady, you're the one desperate enough to marry a man you ain't never met. What's that say about you? About your dead husband? Maybe Thomas wasn't much either, and that's why—" "Don't." Margaret's voice shook with fury. "Don't you dare talk about Thomas." "Why not? Everyone else does. How he left you high and dry with a failing ranch and debts up to your eyeballs. How you couldn't even keep him interested enough to a shadow fell across the street." Margaret looked up to see Elias standing at the edge of the crowd, his hat in his hands, dust on his clothes from the fence work. His face was blank, carefully controlled, but his eyes were winter storms turned deadly. He must have come back early, must have seen her wagon still in town and come looking. "Speak of the devil," Clint sneered, turning to face Elias, the mail-order man himself. "Tell me something, friend. Can you actually talk? Or did the widow order you because broken men come cheaper?" Elias didn't respond. He walked forward with measured steps, each movement controlled and deliberate. The crowd parted for him instinctively, sensing something dangerous. "Elias," Margaret said urgently, "don't. He's not worth it." But Elias wasn't looking at her. His entire focus was on Clint Harlow, who was too drunk and too stupid to recognize the danger standing in front of him. "What's the matter?" Clint taunted. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you really are simple like everyone. Say her name again." The words cut through the afternoon air like a blade. Elias's voice was low, controlled, but carrying an edge that made everyone with an earshot go still. Clint blinked, confused. "What? You said her name?" Elias took another step forward. "Margaret Kane, my wife." "Say it again." The threat was unmistakable. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This was what Elias had been afraid of. This rage, this darkness he'd kept locked away for so long. "Elias, please," she started. "Say it." Elias repeated, his voice dropping even lower. "Go ahead. Say her name one more time the way you just did. Like she's something cheap, something shameful, like she's cursed." Clint's bravado faltered. He was starting to realize he'd miscalculated badly. "I didn't mean yes, you did." Elias was directly in front of him now, towering over the younger man. "You meant every word, just like you mean it every time you see her in town and whisper behind your hand, every time you laugh when she walks past." The street had gone completely silent. Even the piano music from the saloon had stopped. "She's worth 10 of you," Elias continued, his voice vibrating with suppressed fury. 100. She's kept that ranch running through drought and debt and loss that would have broken most men. She's the strongest person in this whole damn town. And you?" He leaned in close. "You're nothing but a coward who gets brave when he's drunk, and there's a woman alone to torment. Now listen here." Clint tried to bluster, but his voice cracked. "No, you listen." Elias's hand shot out and gripped the front of Clint's shirt, pulling him up onto his toes. "You want to talk about curses? I'm cursed. I'm the man who tracked down 5 raiders and killed every last one of them with my bare hands. I'm the man who swore he'd never hurt anyone again, who spent years learning to be gentle because I know exactly what I'm capable of." Margaret could see the tremor running through Elias's arms, the monumental effort it was taking him to maintain control. "But if you ever speak about my wife that way again, if you so much as look at her wrong, I will forget every promise I made to myself. Do you understand me?" Clint nodded frantically, his face gone white. "I can't hear you." "Yes. Yes, I understand." Elias released him so suddenly, Clint stumbled backward, nearly falling. For a long moment, Elias stood there, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists. Then slowly, deliberately, he forced his hands to relax, forced his breathing to steady. He turned to Margaret, the fury drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to. I promised I wouldn't." "Yeah?" Margaret walked up to him and took his hand right there in front of everyone. "Let them see. Let them know." "You didn't fight for pride," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent street. "You fought for respect. My respect. Our respect. There's nothing to apologize for." Elias's eyes searched her face, looking for disgust or fear, but all he found was fierce pride and something else, something that made his breath catch. "Let's go home," she said softly. They walked to the wagon together, her hand still in his, and the crowd parted silently. Margaret held her head high, but inside her heart was racing. Not from fear, from something else entirely. She'd just watched her quiet mail-order husband, the man everyone thought was simple, broken, less than, defend her with a passion she'd never seen from anyone. He'd almost lost control of the darkness he fought so hard to contain, and he'd done it because someone had insulted her name. As they drove out of town, Margaret glanced at Elias. His jaw was still tight, his hands gripping the res too hard. "Talk to me," she said quietly. "I scared you." "No, Margaret. You didn't scare me, Elias. You surprised me. There's a difference." She touched his arm. "That man needed to hear what you said. They all needed to hear it. I almost hit him. Almost." He swallowed hard. For a second there, I was back in Kansas, tracking those raiders, feeling that hunger for violence. "But you didn't. You stopped yourself." "Barely. Barely is enough," she said firmly. "You want to know what I saw back there? I saw a man defending his wife, not with mindless violence, but with controlled fury. There's a difference, Elias. You proved you're not the man you were in Kansas. That man would have hit first and talked never." He was quiet for a long time, watching the road unspool ahead of them. Finally, so softly, she almost missed it. "Thank you for what? For not being afraid of me. For," he paused, struggling with words, "for making me feel like maybe I deserve a second chance." Margaret's throat went tight. "We both deserve a second chance. That's why I sent for you. Not just to save the ranch, to save myself." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was different now. Comfortable, connected. That evening after supper, Elias didn't go straight to the barn. Instead, he sat on the porch with his harmonica. And when Margaret came out to join him, he didn't stop playing. She sat beside him, listening to the mournful melody drift across the darkening land. The song was sad, yes, but there was something new woven through it now, a thread of something lighter. Hope, maybe, or possibility. "Why a harmonica?" she asked when he paused. He turned it over in his hands, running his thumb across the worn metal. "My son gave it to me for my birthday the year before." He stopped, then forced himself to continue before he died. "He was 5 years old, saved up for 3 months to buy it from the traveling merchant." Margaret's eyes burned with tears. "He'd be proud of you, of the man you're trying to be." "I hope so." Elias looked up at the stars just beginning to appear. "I hope wherever he is, he knows I'm trying." Margaret slipped her hand into his fingers curled around hers, tentative at first, then firm. They sat like that until full dark, saying nothing, saying everything. Inside the house, the lamp waited. The bed waited. The life they were slowly, carefully building together waited. But for now, this was enough. The evening air, the distant sound of cattle, the warmth of another person's hand, and the music of a man learning one note at a time, that silence wasn't his only option anymore. The next morning, Margaret woke to find frost coating the windows in delicate patterns that looked like lace. Winter was coming early this year, and the ranch wasn't ready. She dressed quickly, her breath visible in the cold air, and went to start the fire. But when she reached the kitchen, she found Elias had already been there. The stove was warm, coffee was brewing, and he'd left a note on the table in careful, precise handwriting, "Gone to check the cattle." Back by noon, she held the note for a long moment, studying the letters. His penmanship was better than half the men in town, despite what they whispered about him being simple. Each word was formed with deliberate care, the kind of care a man used when words mattered to him. Margaret poured herself coffee and sat at the table, watching the steam rise in the early morning light. Something had shifted between them yesterday, not just in how the town saw them, but in how they saw each other. Elias had shown her the depth of his feeling, the fierce protectiveness he'd been holding back. And she'd shown him that she could handle the truth of who he was, darkness and all. The question was, what came next? She was still pondering this when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses moving fast. Margaret went to the window and felt her stomach drop. 5 riders were coming up the road, and leading them was Samuel Harlow, Clint's father and owner of the biggest ranch in 3 counties. She opened the door before they could knock, stepping out onto the porch with her arms crossed. Mr. Harlow. Samuel Harlow was a big man gone to fat, with a handlebar mustache and eyes that calculated the worth of everything they saw. Behind him, his 4 ranch hands sat their horses with the casual menace of men used to intimidating people. Mrs. Kane. He touched his hat brim, but the gesture was mocking. I believe your husband had some words with my boy yesterday. Your boy had some words with me first, Margaret said coolly. Drunk words, disrespectful words. That may be. Samuel shifted in his saddle, but putting hands on him crosses a line. I'm here to make sure your mail order man understands there will be consequences if it happens again. He's not here. Then we'll wait. Margaret's heart hammered, but she kept her face neutral. This is my property, Mr. Harlow. I don't recall inviting you to wait anywhere on it. Samuel's face darkened. Now you listen here, Margaret. I've been patient with you. Patient when you struggled after Thomas died. Patient when you refused decent offers to sell this land. Patient when you made a spectacle of yourself advertising for a husband like some desperate careful. The word came from the barn. Elias stepped out into the morning light, leading Bessie by her res. He must have come back early, must have seen the riders and come around through the back pasture. You were about to say something disrespectful about my wife again. Samuel's eyes narrowed. So you are here. Good. Saves me having to track you down. Elias tied Bessie to the post and walked forward with that same measured stride he'd used yesterday. Margaret noticed he'd positioned himself between her and the mounted men. Say what you came to say, then leave. Direct. I like that. Samuel leaned forward in his saddle. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to my son. You're going to do it publicly in front of the church next Sunday. And you're going to make sure everyone knows that putting hands on a harlot was a mistake you won't repeat. No. The word hung in the cold air like a challenge. Samuel's face went red. Excuse me. I'm not apologizing, Elias said calmly. Your son insulted my wife, spoke about her dead husband with disrespect. Called her cursed, said things about her character that were lies. I gave him a warning, not a beating. If anything, he got off light. You threatened him. I told him the truth. Elias's voice never rose, never wavered. I told him what would happen if he disrespected Margaret again. That's not a threat, it's a promise. One of the ranch hands, a scarred man with a missing tooth, spat tobacco juice onto the ground. Big words from a mail order man. You think you can take on all of us? Elias looked at him with those winter storm eyes. I think if you try anything on this property, you'll be trespassing. And in Wyoming territory that gives Mrs. Kane the legal right to defend her land with lethal force. She's a good shot. He paused. I'm better. Margaret's breath caught. She hadn't known he could shoot, but the way he said it, with absolute certainty, made her believe him. Made the ranch hands believe him too, judging by how they shifted uneasily in their saddles. Samuel wasn't backing down, though. You think you can threaten my men? You think having a gun makes you dangerous? No, sir. I know having nothing left to lose makes me dangerous. Elias's voice dropped even lower. I've already lost everything that mattered once. My family, my home, my peace of mind, this ranch, this life with Margaret. It's my second chance, my only chance. Which means I'll do whatever it takes to protect it. Do you understand what I'm saying? The words were perfectly polite, perfectly calm, but the meaning underneath was clear as glass. I have already killed for less than this. Samuel understood. Margaret could see it in how his face went from red to pale, how his hand tightened on his reins. Whatever he'd heard about mail-order husbands being weak and desperate, this man in front of him matched none of those expectations. This isn't over, Samuel said finally. You've made an enemy today. Had plenty of those, Elias shrugged. One more doesn't scare me. The Harlow men wheeled their horses and rode off, leaving dust hanging in the air. Margaret waited until they disappeared over the rise before letting out the breath she'd been holding. Elias, I know. He turned to face her, and she saw the tremor in his hands that he'd hidden from the Harlows. I know. I just made things worse, but I couldn't. I won't let them intimidate you. Not on your own land. Margaret walked down the porch steps and took both his shaking hands in hers. You were magnificent. He blinked, surprised. I was reckless. You were brave. There's a difference. She squeezed his hands. But Elias, you said you could shoot. Can you really? His mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. In Kansas, I was a scout during the border troubles. Before that, I learned to shoot from my father, who learned from his. I can hit a playing card at 50 yards. Could do it blindfolded if I had to. He looked away. It's one of the skills I wish I didn't have. Well, I'm glad you have it now, Margaret said firmly. And I'm glad you're here. They stood like that for a moment, hands clasped, the morning sun warming their faces. Then Elias gently pulled away. I should check the north fence. Storm's coming tonight. I can feel it. I'll come with you. He started to protest, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he just nodded and went to saddle the horses. They rode out together across the frozen grassland, their breath steaming in the cold air. The sky was that peculiar shade of white-gray that promised snow, and the wind had a bite to it that cut through layers of clothing. But Margaret barely felt the cold. She was too aware of Elias riding beside her, the way he kept glancing over to make sure she was all right. The protective set of his shoulders. When they reached the fence line, they dismounted and walked along it together, checking for breaks or weak posts. Elias worked with his usual efficiency, but Margaret noticed he stayed close to her, always within arm's reach. You're worried, she said finally. Samuel Harlow is not a man who forgets a slight. He'll retaliate. Let him try. Elias looked at her sharply. Margaret, I mean it. She faced him squarely. I'm tired of being scared. Tired of bowing down to men like him just because they have more money, or more land, or more friends. You stood up for me yesterday and again today. The least I can do is stand beside you. Something fierce and proud flashed across his face. You're something else. You know that I'm a Cain, she said with a slight smile. We're stubborn. That you are. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather light. That you definitely are. The intimacy of the gesture made Margaret's heart skip. They'd been married almost 2 months now, but this was the first time he'd touched her with something other than practical necessity. His hand lingered near her cheek, and she saw him waring with himself about whether to pull away or move closer. Elias, she said softly, it's okay. What is this? Us, whatever we're becoming. She covered his hand with hers, pressing it against her cheek. We don't have to rush, but we don't have to keep so much distance either. His eyes searched hers. I don't want to presume. You're not presuming. I'm inviting. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she pushed on. I've been thinking about you in the barn every night. About this marriage that's legal, but not real. And I wonder if maybe we could… Yes. The word came out strangled, desperate. Margaret laughed softly. I haven't even finished the question. Don't care, whatever you're offering? Yeah. He took a shaky breath. Margaret, I haven't since Kansas, since my wife died, I haven't let myself get close to anyone. Didn't think I deserved it. Didn't think I could trust myself, but with you, with me, with you, I want to try. Want to be the kind of husband you deserve, if you'll let me. Margaret rose on her toes and kissed him. It was brief and chaste, just a brush of lips, but it was enough. Enough to say, yes, I'll let you. Yes, I want this. Yes, we're going to be okay. When she pulled back, Elias looked stunned, like he'd been struck by lightning. Then slowly a real smile spread across his face, the first genuine unguarded smile she'd seen from him. We should finish the fence, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We should, Margaret agreed, but neither of them moved. The snow started that night, thick flakes that fell silent and steady, covering the world in white. Margaret made venison stew for dinner, while Elias brought in extra firewood, stacking it by the door until they had enough to last a week. When he came in from his final trip, his coat was dusted with snow and his cheeks were red from cold. "Storm's going to be bad," he said, stomping his boots clean. "Might last a few days." "Good thing we're prepared then." Margaret ladled stew into bowls. "Come eat before it gets cold." They ate together at the small table, and for the first time, the silence between them was easy, comfortable. Every now and then, their eyes would meet and small smiles would pass between them. Acknowledgement of the shift that had happened on the fence line. After dinner, Elias washed the dishes, as always, but when he dried his hands and reached for his coat, Margaret stopped him. "You don't have to go to the barn tonight." He froze, coat halfway on. "Margaret, unless you want to, but the storm's only getting worse, and the barn's not insulated. You'll freeze out there." She twisted her hands together, nervous. "The bedroom's small, but there's space for both of us. I trust you, Elias. I want you to know that." For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he carefully hung his coat back on the hook. "I'll sleep on the floor. Let you have the bed." "We'll figure it out," Margaret said. "Come on." She led him to the bedroom, suddenly aware of how intimate the space was. The bed she'd slept in alone for 2 years. The nightstand with her mother's Bible. The window that looked out over the land they were building together. Elias stood awkwardly by the door while Margaret pulled extra blankets from the trunk. "Here, I'll make a pallet." "Margaret?" He caught her hand. "Can I? Would it be all right if I just held you?" Her heart hammered. "Held me?" "I know it's too soon for more, but I've been sleeping alone for 5 years. And before that, I spent 3 years sleeping light, ready for trouble. Just once, I'd like to fall asleep knowing someone's safe beside me. Someone. He swallowed hard. "Someone I care about." Margaret set down the blankets. "Get in bed." They lay down together, both fully dressed, both stiff with uncertainty. Margaret blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of snow through the window. For several minutes they lay there rigid, not touching, barely breathing. Then Elias spoke into the darkness. "May I?" "Yes." He turned on his side and carefully, slowly put his arm around her waist, drew her back against his chest. Margaret felt the warmth of him, the solid reality of another person, and something in her chest that had been locked tight for 2 years finally relaxed. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" "For giving me this. For not being afraid. For being you." Margaret laced her fingers through his, where they rested on her stomach. "Thank you for defending me, for seeing me, for staying." Outside, the snow fell heavier, muffling the world in white silence. Inside, two people who'd been broken by loss and loneliness held each other and felt for the first time in years like they might survive the winter. After all, the storm lasted 3 days, just as Elias had predicted. They were snowed in completely, the ranch house, a small island in a sea of white. But instead of feeling trapped, Margaret felt like they'd been given a gift. Time to simply exist together without the pressure of the outside world. They fell into new rhythms. Elias would wake first and start the fire, then come back to bed until the room warmed. They'd breakfast together, talking about small things, the weather, the cattle they hoped were surviving the storm, plans for spring planting. He started to open up more, sharing stories from his childhood in Missouri, from his years as a scout. Not Kansas, never Kansas, but other memories, softer ones. Margaret told him about Thomas. Not just the good parts, but the hard parts too. How he'd been kind but distant, more in love with the idea of ranching than the reality. How she'd felt like a business partner more than a wife. How his death had been terrible, yes, but also in some ways a relief because she'd finally been free to run things her own way. "Does that make me awful?" she asked on the second day as they sat by the fire, darning socks. Elias looked up from the sock he was working on. He'd insisted on learning, said it was practical, and shook his head. "Makes you honest. Not every marriage is a love match. Sometimes people do the best they can with what they have. Were you with your wife? A love match?" He was quiet for a long time, Sarah was good, kind, patient with me when I came back from scouting missions all twisted up inside. We had respect, friendship. Love came later after our son was born, different kind of love than the stories talk about, but real. He set down his mending. What we're building, you and me. It feels different, like maybe it could be more than just surviving together. It already is more, Margaret said softly. That night they lay in bed, and Elias told her about his son, about how James had loved horses, how he'd follow Elias around the farm, asking 1,000 questions, how his laugh had sounded like bells, how he died quickly, at least shot in the first volley when the raiders came, spared the suffering his mother had endured. Margaret held him while he talked, feeling the tremor in his voice, the weight of grief he'd carried alone for so long. When he finally fell silent, she kissed his temple and said, "He was lucky to have you as a father, even for just 5 years." "I hope so," Elias whispered. "I really hope so." On the third day, the snow stopped and the sun came out, turning the world into a blinding landscape of white and diamonds. Elias ventured out to check on the animals and came back reporting that they'd lost only 2 chickens to the cold. A miracle considering. "We'll need to go to town soon," Margaret said, reviewing their supplies. "We're low on flour and coffee." Elias's face darkened after what happened with the Harlos. "We can't let them control where we go. Besides, we need supplies." She touched his arm. "We'll be fine together." They set out the next morning, the wagon crunching through snow-packed roads. The town looked like something from a Christmas card, all white roofs and icicles glinting in the sun. But the magical appearance couldn't hide the tension Margaret felt as they drove down Main Street. People stared more than usual, and there was something different in their stares. Not just curiosity now, but weariness, fear even. At the mercantile, Mr. Henderson was polite but distant. He filled their order quickly, barely making eye contact. "That'll be $8, he said, not quite meeting Margaret's gaze. "James." Margaret leaned on the counter. "What's going on? Why are you acting like we've got the plague?" Henderson glanced at Elias, who was waiting by the door. "The Harlows have been talking, saying your husband's dangerous, violent, that he threatened to kill Clint and Samuel both." "That's not true," Margaret said firmly. "He defended me when Clint was drunk and disrespectful. That's all." "Maybe so." Henderson shrugged. "But Samuel Harlow's a powerful man. People are choosing sides, Margaret, and most can't afford to choose yours." The words stung, but Margaret straightened her spine. "Then they're cowards. $8, you said." She paid, and they loaded the wagon in silence. As they were about to leave, Clara Morrison appeared on the sidewalk with 2 other women from the church auxiliary. "Margaret," Clara said, her voice dripping false sympathy, "I heard about the incident with the Harlows." "How dreadful for you." "Nothing dreadful about a man defending his wife," Margaret replied evenly. "Of course not. But people are worried, dear. Your husband has quite the temper, doesn't he?" One wonders what might happen behind closed doors when Elias stepped forward and all 3 women took an involuntary step back. He didn't say anything. Didn't have to. The look on his face said everything. "My husband," Margaret said clearly, "is the gentlest man I've ever known. He's also the strongest, the most honorable, and the bravest. If that frightens you, Clara, that's your problem, not ours." She climbed into the wagon, and Elias followed. As they drove away, Margaret could feel every eye in town tracking their progress. "They're afraid of me," Elias said quietly. "Good," he looked at her, surprised. "Let them be afraid," Margaret continued, her voice tight with anger. "Better than being pied, better than being dismissed. They want to make you the villain." "Fine, at least a villain gets respect." "Margaret, no, I mean it. I'm tired of playing nice with people who were never nice to us. Tired of trying to fit into their idea of acceptable. We'll build our life, work our land, and to hell with what Silver Ben thinks about it." A slow smile spread across Elias's face. "You're fierce when you're angry. You know that. I learned from the best," she said, looking at him meaningfully. They rode home through the winter landscape, and despite everything, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. The town could whisper, the Harlows could threaten. None of it mattered as long as she had this man beside her. This partnership they were forging from loneliness and need into something stronger. That evening, after the animals were fed and dinner was cleared, Elias didn't immediately reach for his harmonica. Instead, he turned to Margaret. "Teach me to dance." She blinked. "What?" "Dancing. I never learned proper. Sarah tried to teach me once, but I was hopeless." He stood, extending his hand. "I want to learn with you." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Elias, we don't have music." "Sure we do." He hummed a tune, slow and simple, the kind of waltz played at every church social. Then he pulled her close, placing one hand at her waist, clasping her hand with the other. They moved awkwardly around the small kitchen, Elias counting steps under his breath, Margaret trying not to laugh when he stepped on her toes. His humming was off-key and his timing was terrible, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the way he held her like she was something precious. The way he looked at her like she was worth learning for. "Why now?" she asked as they swayed in the lamplight. "Why did you want to learn tonight?" Elias stopped moving but didn't let her go. "Because today in town, watching how those people looked at you, how they judged you for choosing me, I realized something. You gave up a lot to marry me. Your reputation, your standing in the community, the chance to marry someone respectable who wouldn't make your life harder." "Elias, let me finish." He cupped her face with one hand. "You gave up a lot, but I want to give you things too. Not just protection or help with the ranch. I want to give you moments like this. Dancing in the kitchen, laughter, joy, things you've been missing for too long." Margaret's tears spilled over. "You've already given me so much. You've made me feel seen, valued, strong enough to stand up to people like Clara Morrison and the Harlows. You were always that strong. I just reminded you." She kissed him then properly this time, not a brief brush of lips, but a real kiss, deep and searching. Elias made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, his hands spanning her back. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough, I need, I know, me too." She took his hand and led him to the bedroom. "Come to bed, Elias. Really, come to bed." What happened next was tender and hesitant and real. Two wounded people finding each other in the darkness, building something new from the ruins of what they'd lost. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Margaret's head on Elias's chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I'd have this again," he murmured, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "After Kansas, I thought that part of my life was over." "Nothing's over," Margaret said. "We're just beginning." He pressed a kiss to her hair and held her tighter, and outside the winter wind sang through the eaves like a promise of spring to come. The next weeks passed in a blur of work and growing intimacy. They'd crossed a threshold that night after the dance, and there was no going back. They were truly married now, not just in law, but in every way that mattered. Partners in work and in bed, building a life that was uniquely theirs. But the shadow of the Harlows hung over them. Samuel made good on his threat, spreading rumors that intensified with each telling. Elias wasn't just quiet now. He was dangerous, unstable, possibly insane. He'd been a killer in Kansas, people whispered. A gunfighter, a man with no conscience, and nothing to lose. Some of it was true. Most was exaggeration. All of it made life harder. Merchants charged them higher prices. Ranch hands avoided their property when looking for work. At church, the pews around them stayed conspicuously empty. Only Reverend Michaels treated them the same, greeting them warmly and including them in prayers. Margaret bore it all with her head high, but Elias could see the toll it took, the way her smile became forced, the tightness around her eyes. She was being punished for choosing him, and it ate at him like acid. "Maybe I should leave," he said one night in bed. Margaret sat up so fast she nearly knocked heads with him. "What?" "Leave. Go back east. File for annulment." The words tasted like ash. "You'd be better off. Don't you dare." Margaret's voice shook with fury. "Don't you dare make that decision for me. I chose you, Elias Ward. Chose you knowing full well what it would cost. And I'd choose you again every single time. But the town, to hell with the town. To hell with the Harlows and Clara Morrison, and every small-minded gossip from here to Cheyenne." She grabbed his face between her hands. "You are my husband. This is our life, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take it from us." Her vehemence startled him, then made him laugh, a real genuine laugh that bubbled up from deep inside. "Yes, Mum, I mean it. I know you do. That's why I love you." The words hung in the air between them. Elias looked as shocked as Margaret felt. He hadn't meant to say it. She could see it in his face. But now that he had, he couldn't take it back. "You love me?" Margaret whispered. "Yes." His voice was steady now, certain. "I love you, probably have for weeks now, but I didn't. I wasn't sure I should say it." "Why not?" "Because love's been dangerous for me. Everyone I've loved, I've lost. And the thought of loving you and losing you," his voice cracked, "it terrifies me." Margaret kissed him softly. "Love's always dangerous, but it's also the only thing worth the risk. And Elias, I love you too." They made love then, with a new intensity, a new awareness that what they had was rare and precious and worth fighting for, worth standing against the whole town if necessary. And as winter slowly gave way to early spring, as the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared in the frozen ground, they prepared themselves for whatever came next together. Because that's what love meant, not the absence of fear or struggle or pain, but facing it all with someone by your side who'd rather fight beside you than live without you. Spring arrived with deceptive gentleness, bringing warmer winds and the smell of thawing earth. Margaret and Elias worked from dawn to dusk, preparing for the season ahead, mending fences the winter had damaged, checking cattle for signs of illness, planning which fields to plant. The work was endless and exhausting, but they did it together, and that made all the difference. On a Tuesday morning in late March, Margaret was hanging laundry when she saw dust rising on the road. A writer was coming fast, and as he got closer, she recognized young Tommy Chen, the Chinese boy who worked at the telegraph office. He couldn't have been more than 14, and he looked terrified. "Mrs. Ward," he called out, using her married name. Most people in town still called her Mrs. Kane, refusing to acknowledge the marriage. "Mrs. Ward, I got a message for you." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and walked to meet him. "What is it, Tommy?" The boy glanced nervously toward the barn where Elias was working. "It's from the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne. They sent it to Mr. Henderson at the Mercantile, but he said I should bring it directly to you. Said you'd want to know right away." He handed her the folded telegram with shaking hands. Margaret's stomach nodded as she read the formal words. Inquiry regarding Elias Ward. Stop. Reports of wanted man in Silverbend. Stop. Marshal arriving April 2nd to investigate. Stop. The paper trembled in her fingers. April 2nd was 5 days away. "Who sent the inquiry?" she asked quietly. Tommy shifted his weight. "Don't know for certain, Ma'am, but I heard Mr. Harlow talking to the telegraph operator yesterday about sending a message to Cheyenne about a dangerous man who might be a fugitive. Of course, Samuel Harlow couldn't intimidate them into leaving, so now he was trying to have Elias arrested." Margaret looked up at the boy. "Does anyone else know about this?" "Mr. Henderson does, and probably the Harlows by now." Tommy's young face was earnest. "Mrs. Ward? I don't believe the things people say about Mr. Ward. He's always been kind when I've seen him. My ma says a man who treats horses gentle has a good heart." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank your mother for me, and Tommy, thank you for bringing this straight to us." The boy nodded and rode off quickly, kicking up dust. Margaret stood in the yard holding the telegram, her mind racing. 5 days. They had 5 days before a marshal arrived to investigate whether Elias was wanted for crimes. And given what Elias had told her about Kansas, about tracking down those raiders and killing them, there was a real chance he could be arrested. She found him in the barn repairing a saddle. He looked up when she entered, and his smile faded immediately when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" She handed him the telegram without a word, watched as he read it, saw the color drain from his face. When he looked up, his eyes were hollow. "I knew it would catch up eventually," he said quietly, "just hoped it would take longer." "Elias, what exactly happened in Kansas? I need to know everything." He set down the saddle and sank onto a hay bale, suddenly looking much older. "After Sarah and James died, I tracked the men who killed them, 5 of them. Took me 3 months to find them all. They were part of a raiding group that had been terrorizing homesteaders, stealing cattle, burning farms. No law would touch them because their leader was connected to powerful people in the territorial government. So you took justice into your own hands. I took revenge. His voice was bitter. Justice would have been a trial, a hanging. What I did was hunt them down one by one and kill them. Not clean kills either. I wanted them to suffer the way Sarah suffered, the way I was suffering. Margaret sat down beside him, taking his hand. Did they ever charge you? No. The territorial government wanted it all buried. The raiders' leader had friends in high places, and bringing me to trial would have exposed their crimes. So they let me walk, told me to leave Kansas and never come back. He looked at her with anguished eyes. But Margaret, if a marshal starts digging into my past, starts asking questions in Kansas, they'll find people who remember, who will say I'm a murderer, and they won't be wrong. You're not a murderer. You were a grieving man who I am, though. That's the truth of it. He pulled his hand away, stood up, and paced. I killed 5 men in cold blood. Didn't matter that they deserved it. Didn't matter that I was out of my mind with grief. I still did it. And if the law decides to prosecute me now, I'll hang. The word hung in the air between them like a noose. Margaret felt ice spread through her veins. We could run, leave tonight, head to California or Oregon, start over somewhere they'll never find us, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, never settling down, never trusting anyone. Elias shook his head. That's no life, Margaret, especially not for you. You'd lose this ranch, everything you've worked for. I don't care about the ranch if you're not here. Yes, you do, and you should. He knelt in front of her, taking both her hands. This land is your legacy, your future. I won't let you throw it away from me. Then what do we do? Margaret's voice broke. Just wait for the marshal to arrive and hope for the best. Hope that Samuel Harlow didn't find evidence that will get you arrested. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then we tell the truth, all of it. Lay out exactly what happened in Kansas, why I did what I did. Maybe the marshal will understand. Maybe he won't. But at least we'll face it honestly. That's a terrible plan. It's the only plan I've got. He managed a small smile. Besides, I'm tired of running from my past, tired of letting it control me. Whatever happens, at least we'll face it together. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist they flee or fight or do anything but passively wait for judgment. But she could see the determination in Elias's face, the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd been carrying guilt for too long. He needed to face this, needed to finally put Kansas behind him one way or another. Then we prepare, she said firmly. We gather character witnesses, document everything you've done for this community. Show the marshal who you are now, not who you were 5 years ago. Margaret, no. If you're going to face this honestly, we're going to give you the best chance possible. She stood, her mind already racing through possibilities. Reverend Michaels will speak for you. Maybe Mr. Henderson if we ask right. And we document everything. The work you've done on the ranch, the improvements, your behavior since arriving. Elias looked at her with such love and gratitude it made her chest ache. How did I get so lucky? You answered a desperate widow's advertisement, Margaret said, trying to lighten the moment. Not sure that counts as luck. Best decision I ever made. They spent the next 3 days preparing for the marshal's arrival. Margaret went to town and spoke with Reverend Michaels, who agreed immediately to testify to Elias's character. She tried to convince Mr. Henderson to speak on their behalf, but he refused, citing his business relationship with the Harlows. Several other townspeople she approached also declined, fear of Samuel Harlow winning out over any sense of justice. Only old Doc Morrison, Clara's husband, surprised her by agreeing to help. I'm not blind to my wife's fault, he said gruffly when Margaret found him at his office, or to the Harlows' bullying. If your husband is half the man you say he is, he deserves a fair hearing. Margaret could have kissed the old doctor. Instead, she shook his hand gratefully and hurried home to tell Elias they had 3 character witnesses. The night before the marshal was due to arrive, neither of them could sleep. They lay in bed, holding each other, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. If they arrest me, Elias said quietly, I want you to sell everything and leave Silver Bend. Go somewhere fresh, somewhere people don't know you. I'm not leaving, Margaret. I said I'm not leaving. She turned to face him in the darkness. If they arrest you, I'll fight it. I'll hire lawyers. I'll go to the territorial capital. I'll do whatever it takes. But I'm not abandoning you. Even if I'm convicted, even if they hang me. The words made her flinch, but she didn't look away. Even then, you stood up for me when no one else would. You gave me back my strength, my pride. I'm not letting you face this alone. Elias pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. She felt his shoulders shake and realized he was crying. Silent tears that spoke of years of held-back emotion finally breaking free. I don't deserve you, he whispered. You deserve everything good in this world, Margaret said fiercely, and I'm going to make sure you get a chance at it. They made love that night with desperate intensity, clinging to each other like drowning people, trying to memorize every touch, every sensation, in case it was their last time. Afterward they lay, tangled together until dawn light began creeping through the window. Time to face it, Elias said, his voice steady, despite the fear Margaret knew he must be feeling. They dressed carefully, Elias in his best shirt and trousers, Margaret in her Sunday dress. They ate a quiet breakfast neither of them tasted, then sat on the porch to wait. Marshal Pike arrived at Tenny Shao, riding a big bay horse with a younger deputy trailing behind him. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with iron-grey hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted and approached the porch with the measured steps of a man who'd walked into danger before and knew how to handle it. Mr. and Mrs. Ward. That's right. Elias stood, offering his hand. I'm Elias Ward. This is my wife, Margaret. Pike shook hands with both of them, his grip firm and assessing. I'm Marshal Richard Pike out of Cheyenne. Got a report that you might be wanted for crimes committed in Kansas. That true? Depends on what you mean by wanted, Elias said carefully. I killed 5 men in Kansas 5 years ago. The territorial government there knew about it and let me go. I was never formally charged. Pike's eyebrows rose slightly at the directness. That's so. Why don't you tell me the whole story and we'll see where we stand? They invited the marshal and his deputy inside. Margaret served coffee while Elias told the story, leaving nothing out. The murder of his family, the 3-month hunt. Each killing described in brutal detail. When he finished, the small kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Pike took a long drink of his coffee. That's quite a tale, Mr. Ward. You got any proof of what you're saying? Anyone who can verify this? I can give you names in Kansas. Sheriff Dobbs in Leavenworth County knew the whole situation. So did Judge Harmon. They're the ones who decided not to prosecute, and since then, you've been here in Wyoming. Yes, sir. Arrived in September, married Margaret, been working the ranch. Any trouble, fights, threats, violence of any kind? Margaret spoke up before Elias could. There was an incident with a local rancher's son who was drunk and disrespectful. Elias defended my honor but didn't strike anyone, just words. Pike turned his sharp gaze on her. That all it was. The rancher's son was insulting my late husband in calling me cursed. My husband defended me. That's what good men do. The marshal's mouth twitched slightly, like he might be fighting a smile. That's so. And this local rancher, he wouldn't happen to be the one who filed the complaint about your husband, would he? Samuel Harlow, Margaret confirmed. He's been trying to force us off our land since Elias arrived. Interesting. Pike pulled out a small notebook and made a note. I'll need to talk to some folks in town, get their perspective on your character, Mr. Ward. You got anyone who will speak for you? Reverend Michaels from the church, Elias said. Doc Morrison, maybe a few others. Right then, Deputy Hayes and I will ride into town. Ask around. Mr. Ward, I'm going to have to ask you to stay put until I finish my investigation. Don't leave the ranch. I understand. Pike stood, settling his hat back on his head. Mrs. Ward, might I have a word with you outside? Margaret followed him onto the porch, her heart hammering. The deputy stayed inside with Elias, casual but clearly standing guard. Mrs. Ward, Pike said quietly, I need you to be honest with me. Do you feel safe with your husband? Has he ever threatened you, hurt you, shown the kind of violence he described from Kansas? Never. Margaret met his eyes squarely. Marshal, my husband is the gentlest man I've ever known. He's kind to animals, respectful to me, works hard without complaint. Whatever he did in Kansas, he did it out of grief and pain. He's not that man anymore. People don't change that much. Yes, they do, especially when they're given a reason to. Margaret's voice was firm. Elias has a reason now. He has me, this ranch, a chance at a real life. He wouldn't throw that away. Pike studied her face for a long moment. You love him. That it wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway with all my heart, even knowing what he's capable of. Especially knowing because I also know he chooses every day not to be that person. That's real strength, Marshall. Not the absence of violence, but the choice not to use it. Pike nodded slowly. I'll be in touch, Mrs. Ward. Keep your husband here until I sort this out. They rode away, leaving Margaret and Elias alone with the crushing weight of uncertainty. Elias sank into a chair, his face grey. He's going to arrest me, he said flatly. I saw it in his eyes. You don't know that, Margaret. I confessed to 5 murders. What else can he do? Wait for the investigation, hear from the character witnesses, get the full story. Margaret knelt in front of him. Don't give up yet. We haven't lost. But the fear in Elias's eyes said he believed they already had. The marshal spent 2 days in Silver Bend interviewing people. Margaret heard reports from Tommy Chen, who seemed to have appointed himself their spy. Pike talked to Reverend Michaels for over an hour. Spent time with Doc Morrison, even interviewed some of the ranch hands who'd seen Elias around town. But he also talked to Samuel Harlow, to Clint, to Clara Morrison, and the other gossips who'd been spreading rumors for months. On the 3rd day, Pike returned to the ranch with Deputy Hayes and 2 other men Margaret didn't recognize. Her blood turned to ice when she saw the handcuffs on Pike's belt. Mr. Ward, Pike said formally, I need you to come with me to Cheyenne. I've sent telegrams to Kansas, and there's some question about whether you were actually cleared of those killings or if the authorities there just looked the other way. Until that's sorted out, you're under arrest. No. Margaret rushed forward, but Elias caught her hand. It's all right, he said quietly. I knew this might happen. It's not all right, Marshal. Please, you can't. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but until I get confirmation from Kansas that he's not wanted, I have to take him into custody. It's the law. Pike looked genuinely regretful. He'll get a fair hearing. I promise you that. Elias turned to Margaret, cupping her face in his hands. Listen to me. Don't sell the ranch. Don't give up on this place. Whatever happens, you keep fighting. You hear me? I'm coming with you to Cheyenne. No, you need to stay here. Keep the ranch running. I'll be fine. Elias. He kissed her deep and desperate, a kiss that tasted like goodbye. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. I love you, Margaret Ward. That's the truest thing I've ever said in my life. I love you too, she whispered, and I'm going to get you back, I swear it. Pike cuffed Elias's hands in front of him, a small mercy. As they led him to the horses, Elias looked back at the ranch, at Margaret standing on the porch, at the life they'd built together. His face was composed, but Margaret could see the grief in every line of his body. Then they were gone, riding toward Cheyenne and whatever fate waited there. Margaret stood on the porch until the dust settled, until she couldn't see them anymore. Then she went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and let herself break down. Great racking sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest, the sound of a heart being torn in 2. She cried until she had no tears left. Then she washed her face, braided her hair, and started planning. If the law wouldn't help Elias, she'd have to do it herself. And she'd start by making sure Samuel Harlow paid for what he'd done. The next morning, Margaret rode into Silver Bend with fire in her blood. She went straight to the telegraph office and sent a message to the sheriff and judge in Kansas that Elias had named. She needed their statements in writing, needed proof that he'd been cleared. Then she went to Reverend Michaels and asked him to write a letter testifying to Elias's character. The Reverend agreed immediately, his kind face creased with concern. I'll pray for him, Margaret, and for you. Pray if you like, Reverend, but I'm going to need more than prayers to get him back. Doc Morrison also agreed to write a letter and surprise Margaret by offering to pay for a lawyer if she needed one. My Clara has been insufferable since this started, he said gruffly, crowing about the mail order man getting what he deserves. I'm tired of her meanness." Margaret thanked him and moved on to her next task, confronting Samuel Harlow. She found him at the saloon holding court with a group of his ranch hands. When she walked through the doors, every conversation stopped. Women didn't come into the saloon, not respectable women, but Margaret was past caring about respectability. "Samuel Harlow," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "I want a word with you." Harlow turned, a smug smile on his face. "Mrs. Kane heard your husband got arrested." "Shame that Mrs. Ward," Margaret corrected coldly. "And you know perfectly well you're the reason he was arrested. You filed that complaint, spread those lies about him being a fugitive." "Lies." Harlow spread his hands innocently. "I simply reported what I knew. If your husband has a criminal past, that's hardly my fault. He has a tragic past. There's a difference. And you've been trying to destroy him since the day he arrived because you can't stand that I chose him over your attempts to force me off my land." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Harlow's face darkened. "Careful, Mrs. Kane. You're making accusations you can't prove." "Can't I?" Margaret stepped closer. "You've wanted my ranch for 2 years. Offered to buy it for a fraction of its worth after Thomas died. When I refused, you made sure the banks wouldn't extend my credit. When I married Elias, you started spreading rumors that he was dangerous, violent, unstable. And when that didn't work, you contacted the marshal and had him arrested on trumped-up charges. Those charges are legitimate. Those charges are revenge." Margaret's voice rose. "Because your son got drunk and insulted me, and my husband defended my honor. Because you can't stand that a woman would choose her own husband instead of accepting your bullying." Harlow stood, his face red with fury. "You've got no proof of any of this, don't I? Tommy Chen heard you at the telegraph office sending that message to Cheyenne. Several people have heard you spreading rumors. And I've got 3 character witnesses willing to testify that everything you've said about Elias is a lie." She pulled out the letters she'd collected from Reverend Michaels and Doc Morrison, along with a third from Mr. Henderson that she'd finally convinced him to write. "These men know my husband, know his character. They'll swear he's no threat to anyone." Harlow's eyes narrowed. "Doesn't matter what they say. He admitted to killing 5 men. That makes him a murderer. Plain and simple. It makes him a grieving father and husband who took justice into his own hands when the law failed him. And it was 5 years ago, Samuel. 5 years he's lived peacefully, hurt no one, started over. He's not the same man. Once a killer, always a killer." Margaret smiled then, a cold smile that made several people step back. "You know what the funny thing is? You're trying to paint my husband as dangerous, as someone the town should fear. But he's shown more restraint, more honor, more decency than you ever have. He could have beaten Clint bloody for what he said to me. He didn't. He gave him a warning and walked away. When you came to our ranch with your men trying to intimidate us, he didn't draw a gun. He stood his ground with words. That's not a dangerous man, Samuel. That's a man in control of himself. He threatened to kill my son. He promised consequences if Clint disrespected me again. There's a difference between a threat and a boundary." Margaret looked around the saloon at all the watching faces. "I'm going to Cheyenne tomorrow to stand by my husband during his hearing, and I'm going to make sure everyone there knows that Samuel Harlow filed a false complaint out of spite and greed. If my husband is convicted based on your lies, I'll make it my life's mission to expose what you did." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing, Samuel. If anything happens to my ranch while I'm gone, if one cow goes missing or one fence gets cut, I'll know exactly who to blame. And I will make you pay for it. That's not a threat. It's a promise." She walked out into the afternoon sunlight, her heart pounding. Behind her, she could hear the explosion of conversation, people talking over each other in shocked tones. Let them talk. She'd said what needed saying. That evening, as she packed for the trip to Cheyenne, Margaret found Elias's harmonica in the barn where he'd left it the night before his arrest. She held it in her hands, remembering all those evenings, listening to him play the mournful melodies that spoke of loss and longing and slowly growing hope. She tucked it carefully into her bag. When she got him back, and she would get him back, she'd return it to him. They'd sit on the porch together and he'd play while she listened, and they'd rebuild the life Samuel Harlow had tried so hard to destroy. The next morning, Margaret boarded the train to Cheyenne with the letters of recommendation, a photograph of her and Elias from their wedding day, and an unshakable determination to fight for the man she loved. The other passengers gave her curious looks. A woman traveling alone was unusual, but she ignored them. The train journey took 6 hours. Margaret spent the time rehearsing what she'd say at the hearing, organizing her evidence, preparing for every possible argument. By the time they pulled into Cheyenne, she had a plan. Finding the territorial courthouse was easy. Getting information about Elias's case was harder. The clerk at the front desk was a sore-faced woman who informed Margaret that the hearing was scheduled for the following morning and that civilian visitors were not permitted unless called as witnesses. "Then call me as a witness," Margaret said firmly. "That's not how it works, ma'am. The marshal decides who testifies. Then I need to speak with Marshal Pike. He's busy with the case." Margaret leaned on the desk, her patience exhausted. "Listen to me carefully. That man in your jail is my husband. He's a good man who made terrible choices out of grief, and he spent 5 years trying to make amends. I have letters from a reverend, a doctor, and multiple townspeople attesting to his character. I have information about the real reason he was reported to the marshal, and I have a right to speak on his behalf. Now, you can let me see Marshal Pike, or I can stand outside this courthouse and tell every person who walks by that you're denying a man a fair hearing. Your choice." The clerk's mouth tightened, but she picked up the telephone and made a call. 5 minutes later, Marshal Pike appeared, looking tired, but not unkind. "Mrs. Ward, I thought I told you to stay at the ranch. With all due respect, Marshal, my husband needs me here more than the ranch does." Pike studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Come on back, we'll talk." Pike led Margaret through a maze of corridors to a small office that smelled of old paper and tobacco smoke. He gestured to a chair across from his desk and sat down heavily, looking at her with those sharp, assessing eyes. "You've got 5 minutes, Mrs. Ward. Make them count." Margaret pulled out the letters and laid them on his desk, one by one. Character testimonies from Reverend Michaels, Dr. Morrison, and James Henderson, who runs the Mercantile in Silver Bend. All 3 attest to my husband's peaceful behavior, his work ethic, and his restraint in difficult situations. Pike glanced at the letters but didn't pick them up. "I've already interviewed 2 of these men. Then you know they're telling the truth. Elias hasn't hurt anyone in 5 years. He's been a model citizen. Except for the incident with Clint Harlow. That wasn't violence, Marshal. That was words. Strong words, yes, but words nonetheless. Clint was drunk and insulting me and my late husband. Elias defended my honor without raising a fist. Isn't that exactly what a man with a violent past who's trying to reform would do? Show restraint." Pike leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You make a good point. But Mrs. Ward, the problem isn't what your husband's done since coming to Wyoming. It's what he did in Kansas. I've been waiting for responses to my telegrams, and I finally got one this morning." Margaret's heart clenched from Sheriff Dobbs. From his successor, actually. Dobbs retired 2 years ago. "The new sheriff, man named Garrett, says there's no record of your husband being formally cleared. Just a notation in the files that the case was dropped due to lack of evidence and witness cooperation. But they did drop it. They let him go. They did. But dropping a case isn't the same as declaring someone innocent. It just means they couldn't prosecute." Pike rubbed his face tiredly. "Here's my problem. Technically, I could arrest your husband for those killings. They're within the statute of limitations for murder, but practically speaking, Kansas doesn't seem interested in pursuing it. They'd have to extradite him, build a case 5 years old, and from what I can tell, nobody there wants to open that can of worms." Hope flared in Margaret's chest. "So you're going to release him?" "I didn't say that." Pike pulled out a document from his desk drawer. "This came in on the second telegram from Judge Harmon, the man your husband mentioned. He sent a deposition explaining the whole situation, the raiders, the political corruption that protected them, everything. He says, and I quote, 'Elias Ward committed homicide in pursuit of justice when the legal system failed him. While his methods were unlawful, his motivation was understandable given the circumstances. He was allowed to leave Kansas with the understanding he would never return, and would live peaceably. He has kept that agreement. Margaret's hands trembled as she absorbed this. That sounds like he's saying Elias shouldn't be prosecuted. It does. But here's where it gets complicated. I've also got Samuel Harlow breathing down my neck, insisting your husband is dangerous and needs to be locked up. He's got friends in the territorial government, and he's making noise about me being soft on crime if I don't prosecute. Samuel Harlow is the reason you arrested Elias in the first place, Margaret said, her voice tight with anger. He filed that complaint because my husband stood up to him. This whole thing is revenge, Marshal. Surely you can see that. Pike was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward. Off the record, Mrs. Ward. Yes, I can see it. On the record, I have to follow the law and political reality, which is why tomorrow's hearing is so important. The territorial judge will review all the evidence and make a determination about whether to charge your husband or release him. Can I testify? You're his wife. Your testimony would be considered biased. Then let me sit in the courtroom. Let the judge see that Elias has someone who loves him, who believes in him. Let him see I'm not afraid. Pike studied her face, and something in his expression softened. You really love him, don't you? This isn't just about protecting your investment in the ranch. I love him more than I thought I could love anyone, Margaret said simply. He's the best man I've ever known. Flawed, yes, haunted by his past. Absolutely. But good. Truly deeply good. And if the law punishes him for trying to survive the worst thing that can happen to a person, if it destroys the new life he's built, then the law is wrong. The law often is, Pike said quietly. But it's all we've got to keep society from tearing itself apart. He stood, signaling the conversation was over. The hearing's at 9 tomorrow morning. You can sit in the gallery, but you can't speak unless called. Understood? Yes, thank you, Marshal. Don't thank me yet. This could still go badly. He walked her to the door, then paused. Mrs. Ward, for what it's worth, I hope you're right about him. Margaret left the courthouse and found a boarding house that would take a woman alone. The room was small and musty, but it didn't matter. She couldn't have slept anyway. She lay awake all night staring at the ceiling, praying to a God she wasn't sure listened, bargaining with fate, doing anything to feel like she had some control over what would happen in the morning. At dawn, she rose and dressed in her best clothes, pinning her hair up carefully. If she was going to fight for Elias, she'd do it looking like the respectable woman she was, not some desperate widow people could dismiss. The courthouse opened at 8. Margaret was there at 7:30, waiting on the steps. Other people began to arrive as the hour approached. Lawyers with their cases, plaintiffs and defendants, curious townspeople drawn by the promise of drama. At 8:45, a wagon pulled up and Marshal Pike climbed out, followed by Elias in handcuffs. Margaret's breath caught. He looked thinner than when she'd last seen him, his face drawn and tired. But when he saw her on the courthouse steps, his entire expression transformed. Love and relief and desperate hope all flashed across his features. Margaret, he said as Pike led him past, you shouldn't be here. There's nowhere else I'd be. They didn't have time for more. Pike was already guiding Elias inside up the stairs to the second-floor courtroom. Margaret followed, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break her ribs. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, with wooden benches for spectators and a raised platform where the judge would sit. Margaret took a seat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind where Elias would stand. He was positioned at a defendant's table with a court-appointed lawyer, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave and kept shuffling papers nervously. At precisely 9 the bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Thaddeus Crawford." The judge who entered was a stern-looking man in his 60s, with white hair and a face that suggested he'd heard every excuse and believed none of them. He took his seat, adjusted his spectacles, and looked down at the papers before him. This is a preliminary hearing for Elias Ward, charged with being a fugitive from justice in the territory of Kansas. Marshal Pike, present your case. Pike stood and laid out the facts in a clear, methodical voice. The killings in Kansas, Elias's admission, the lack of formal charges at the time, the recent complaint filed by Samuel Harlow, the responses from Kansas authorities. When he finished, Judge Crawford turned his attention to Elias. Mr. Ward, you've heard the marshal's statement. How do you plead? Elias stood, his cuffed hands clasped in front of him. Your Honor, I don't deny anything Marshal Pike said. I killed 5 men in Kansas. They'd murdered my wife and son, and I tracked them down and killed them. It was wrong. I know that, but I did it. The courtroom murmured. Judge Crawford banged his gavel once. This court appreciates honesty, Mr. Ward. But you're not helping your case. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Just this, Your Honor. I was a different man 5 years ago, broken, consumed by grief and rage. I did terrible things, and I've spent every day since trying to atone for them. I came to Wyoming to start over, to be better. I married a good woman. I work an honest living. I've hurt no one. I'm not asking you to forgive what I did. I'm asking you to judge me on who I am now, not who I was then. Judge Crawford was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at the papers again. I have here a deposition from Judge Harmon in Kansas, who was on the bench when these killings occurred. He states that the raiders you killed were known criminals who'd been terrorizing the territory. He also states that the decision not to prosecute you was made by the territorial government and himself after careful consideration. Is that accurate? Yes, Your Honor. And in the 5 years since, you've had no contact with Kansas, committed no crimes, lived peacefully. That's correct. Judge Crawford turned to Marshal Pike. What's your recommendation, Marshal? Pike stood again, and Margaret held her breath. Your Honor, based on my investigation, I believe Mr. Ward has been living as a law-abiding citizen since arriving in Wyoming. While his past is troubling, Kansas has declined to request extradition, and there's no evidence he poses a current threat to the community, except for the complaint from Mr. Samuel Harlow of Silverbend. Yes, Your Honor. However, in my interviews, I found that Mr. Harlow has a financial interest in Mr. Ward's property and has been openly hostile toward him since his arrival. I believe the complaint was motivated by personal animus rather than genuine concern for public safety. Margaret wanted to cheer. Pike was on their side. Judge Crawford nodded slowly. I see. Is Mr. Harlow present in this courtroom? There was a stir in the back of the gallery, and Margaret turned to see Samuel Harlow stand up. She hadn't even noticed him come in. He was dressed in his finest suit, his face set in righteous indignation. I am, Your Honor. Mr. Harlow, you filed the initial complaint against Mr. Ward. What exactly did you witness that led you to believe he was a fugitive? Your Honor, it wasn't what I witnessed. It was what I heard. The man admitted to my son and several others that he'd killed people in Kansas. Said he was dangerous, that he'd hunted men down. That's not the kind of person we want in our community. And when did this conversation occur? Harlow hesitated. I didn't hear it directly, Your Honor. My son told me about it. I see. Is your son present? No, Your Honor. He's back in Silverbend running the ranch. Judge Crawford's expression suggested he found this convenient. So you're asking this court to rule based on hearsay from your son, who is not here to testify under oath. Your Honor, I'm trying to protect my community from a known killer. A man who killed 5 years ago in another territory and has since lived peacefully by all accounts. Crawford interrupted. Mr. Harlow, I've been a judge for 32 years. I've learned to recognize when someone is using the law as a weapon in a personal dispute. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your complaint? Any actual evidence of Mr. Ward being a danger? Harlow's face went red. He threatened my son, grabbed him, threw him against a wall. That's not true. Margaret was on her feet before she could stop herself. Your Honor, I was there. My husband used words, not violence. He gave Clint Harlow a warning after Clint insulted me and my late husband while drunk. He didn't touch him beyond gripping his shirt. The judge looked at her sharply. And you are? Margaret Ward, Your Honor, Elias's wife. Mrs. Ward, you're out of order. Sit down. Margaret sat, but not before she saw the flicker of something in Crawford's eyes. Interest, maybe, or consideration. The judge turned back to Harlow. Mr. Harlow, unless you have actual evidence beyond hearsay and disputed accounts of a verbal altercation, I'm inclined to dismiss your complaint. Your Honor, you can't just I can and I will. Marshal Pike's investigation found no current criminal activity. Kansas authorities have declined to pursue the matter, And frankly, your complaint smells more like a land dispute than a legitimate concern for public safety. Crawford looked down at Elias again. Mr. Ward, I'm not going to charge you with being a fugitive because you're not one. Kansas made its decision 5 years ago, and I'm not going to second guess it now. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Relief flooded through her so powerfully she felt lightheaded. But Crawford wasn't finished. However, Mr. Ward, I want to be clear about something. You've admitted to killing 5 men. Self-help justice is not how we do things in civilized society. If you'd committed those acts in Wyoming territory, you'd be facing murder charges regardless of your motivation. The only reason you're walking out of here today is that Kansas doesn't want you back, and Wyoming has no jurisdiction over crimes committed there. I understand, Your Honor. I hope you do, because if you ever raise your hand in violence again for any reason, you'll find yourself right back in front of a judge. And next time, you won't get off so easily. Crawford banged his gavel. Case dismissed. Marshal, release Mr. Ward. The courtroom erupted in noise. Margaret was crying openly now, not caring who saw. Pike removed Elias's handcuffs, and the moment he was free, Elias turned and reached for Margaret. She was already moving, climbing over the railing that separated the gallery from the floor, launching herself into his arms. He caught her and held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. She felt him shaking, felt the tremors of relief and emotion running through his whole body. "It's over," she whispered. "It's over, Elias. We won." "You won," he said, his voice rough. "You fought for me. You saved me. We saved each other." Behind them, Samuel Harlow stormed out of the courtroom, his face purple with rage. Margaret didn't care. Grit. Let him be angry. He had lost, and she and Elias had won their right to exist, to build their life together without his interference. Marshal Pike approached them, his expression softer than Margaret had seen. "Mr. Ward, Mrs. Ward, the judges released you, but I'd advise you to stay out of trouble. Judge Crawford meant what he said about violence." "I know, Marshal. Thank you for investigating fairly, for telling the truth about Harlow's motives." Pike nodded. "Just doing my job." "But Mrs. Ward." He looked at Margaret. "You should know you made the difference. Those letters, your testimony, even though it was out of order, your presence here. The judge saw how much you believed in your husband. That mattered." Margaret squeezed Elias's hand. "He's worth believing in." They left the courthouse together, walking out into bright April sunshine. Cheyenne was busy with midday traffic, horses and wagons, and people going about their business, completely unaware that Margaret and Elias's entire world had just been saved from destruction. "What do we do now?" Elias asked, looking down at her. "We go home. We work the ranch. We live our life." Margaret smiled up at him. "The life we've earned. I need to tell you something first." Elias stopped walking, turning to face her fully in that cell, waiting to find out if I'd hang or go free. "All I could think about was you. How I'd wasted so much time being careful, holding back, trying not to hope for too much. If I'd been convicted, if I died without telling you this properly." He took both her hands. "Margaret, you're the reason I want to live. Not just survive, but actually live. You're the reason I believe I deserve a second chance. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." Margaret's tears started fresh. "I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes." "Me too." He kissed her then, right there on the street in Cheyenne with people walking past and probably staring. Margaret didn't care. She kissed him back with all the fear and relief and love she'd been holding inside. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "Let's go home." They caught the afternoon train back to Silver Bend. The journey that had felt endless when Margaret was traveling alone now seemed too short. They sat close together in their seats, Elias's arm around her shoulders, talking about everything and nothing. Plans for the ranch, the cattle they'd need to buy, the garden Margaret wanted to plant, small, ordinary things that felt precious because they'd almost lost the chance to do them. As the train rolled through the Wyoming landscape, Margaret pulled Elias's harmonica from her bag. "I brought this. Thought you might want it back." Elias took it carefully, turning it over in his hands like a holy object. "You kept it safe. Of course it's important to you. He was quiet for a moment, then lifted the harmonica to his lips and played a few notes. The melody was different from before, lighter, somehow less mournful. When he lowered it, he was smiling. That's new, Margaret said. It's about hope, Elias said. About second chances, about a woman who loved me enough to fight the whole world for me. Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, listening as he played the new melody all the way home. They arrived in Silver Bend just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The town looked the same as when Margaret had left it, but everything felt different. They'd faced the worst and survived. Whatever came next, they could handle it together. As they drove the wagon through town toward the ranch, people stopped to stare. Word must have spread about the hearing, about Harlow's failed attempt to have Elias convicted. Margaret could see the speculation in their faces, the curiosity about what would happen next. Let them wonder. She and Elias had nothing to prove to these people anymore. The ranch looked beautiful in the evening light, the house solid and welcoming, the land stretching out around them like a promise. Elias helped Margaret down from the wagon, and for a moment they just stood there looking at their home. "We did it," Margaret said softly. "We actually did it. We did." Elias pulled her close, "And now we get to do something even harder." "What's that?" "Figure out how to be happy." Margaret laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I think we can manage that." They went inside together, and Elias started a fire while Margaret began preparing supper. They moved around each other with familiar ease, the rhythms of partnership they developed over the past months. But there was something different now, something lighter in the way Elias moved, the way his face had lost some of its haunted quality. "You look different," Margaret said as they sat down to eat. "I feel different, like I've been carrying a weight for 5 years and someone finally helped me set it down." He reached across the table and took her hand. "That someone was you." "The judge helped too," Margaret said with a slight smile. "The judge did his job. You did something much harder. You believed in me when you had every reason not to. You stood by me when it would have been easier to walk away. You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself." His voice grew thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to thank me. That's what love is, Elias. Standing by someone when it's hard, fighting for them when they can't fight for themselves. You'd have done the same for me, in a heartbeat." They finished supper and cleaned up together, then went out to sit on the porch as the stars began to appear. Elias brought his harmonica and played softly while Margaret leaned against him, feeling more at peace than she had in years. "What do you think happens now?" Elias asked between songs. "With Harlow? With the town?" "I don't know, but I do know we don't have to be afraid anymore. We faced the worst they could throw at us, and we survived." Margaret looked up at the stars. "Harlow can't touch us now. The law's already ruled on your past, and if the town wants to keep whispering, let them. We know the truth being that we're good people who deserve to be happy, that our past doesn't define us, that love is stronger than gossip or spite or fear." She turned to look at him. "That's the truth, isn't it?" Elias kissed her forehead gently. "That's the truest thing I've ever heard." They sat like that until the moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across their land. Margaret thought about everything they'd been through, all the obstacles they'd overcome. The gossip and isolation, the Harlow's bullying, the arrest and the trial. Each challenge had tested them, and each time they'd emerged stronger. "I'm glad I sent that advertisement," she said suddenly. Elias chuckled, "even knowing all the trouble it caused, especially knowing that, because the trouble showed me what you're made of, showed me what we're made of together." She shifted to face him fully. "Thomas was a good man, but he was never really my partner, not the way you are. We're building something real here, Elias, something worth all the struggle." "We are," he agreed. "And Margaret, I want you to know I'm done holding back, done being so careful with my words and my feelings. You've shown me I don't have to guard myself so closely anymore. So from now on, I'm going to tell you every day how much I love you. I'm going to talk more, share more, be more present in this life we're building." "I'd like that," Margaret said softly. "I'd like that very much." They went to bed that night and made love with a new freedom. The weight of uncertainty finally lifted. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Elias's arm around her and his heartbeat steady under her ear, Margaret felt complete in a way she never had before. "Elias," she whispered into the darkness, Thank you for answering my advertisement. Thank you for being quiet until the moment that mattered. Thank you for loving me enough to show me who you really are." He pulled her closer. "Thank you for seeing me, for not being afraid, for giving me a reason to believe in second chances." They fell asleep like that, two people who'd found each other in the loneliest places and built something beautiful from their shared brokenness. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the night. The next morning, they woke early and got to work. There was so much to do, so much time they'd lost while dealing with the arrest and hearing, but they worked side by side with renewed energy. Elias talking more than he ever had before, sharing stories and thoughts and observations that Margaret treasured. Around midday, they saw a wagon coming up the road. Margaret tensed automatically, but Elias squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We're okay," he said. "Whatever it is, we can handle it." The wagon proved to be Reverend Michael's, and when he climbed down, his face was heard the good news from town. Judge dismissed the charges. "He did," Margaret confirmed, walking out to greet him. "Thank you for your letter, Reverend." Marshal Pike said it helped. "I only spoke the truth. But I'm glad I could help." Michaels looked at Elias. "How are you holding up, son?" "Better than I have in years," Elias said honestly. "Thank you for believing in me. I believe in redemption. Always have." The Reverend pulled out a wrapped package. "I brought you something. Call it a belated wedding gift." Margaret opened it to find a beautiful family Bible, leather-bound with gold lettering. Inside the front cover, Reverend Michaels had written their names and wedding date in careful script. "For your family records," he explained, "for the children you'll have, the life you'll build. Every family needs a good foundation, and faith is part of that." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again. "Thank you. This means more than you know." After the Reverend left, more visitors came. Doc Morrison stopped by with his medical bag, ostensibly to check on them both, but really just to offer his support. Even Mr. Henderson came out from town awkward and apologetic to say he was glad things had worked out, and he hoped they'd continue doing business at his store. By the end of the week, it was clear that while some in Silver Bend would never accept them, others were willing to give them a fair chance. The town was divided, but Margaret and Elias had allies now, real ones, not just people who tolerated them. The support from people like Reverend Michaels and Doc Morrison created a shift in Silver Bend that Margaret hadn't expected. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but gradual, like ice melting in spring. Some townspeople who'd avoided them began nodding when they passed on the street. Others stopped at the ranch on their way through, ostensibly to ask about cattle prices or weather predictions, but really to take another look at the mail-order husband who'd survived Samuel Harlow's attempt to destroy him. But Harlow himself wasn't finished. Margaret knew it the moment she saw him watching them from across the street during their first Sunday back at church. His eyes held a cold fury that spoke of plans still forming, of revenge not yet abandoned. "He's going to try something else," she murmured to Elias as they took their seats. "Let him try." Elias's voice was calm, but his hand found hers and held tight. "We're ready." The service was halfway through when it happened. Reverend Michaels was reading from Scripture about forgiveness and second chances when Samuel Harlow stood abruptly from his pew. "Reverend, I have something to say." The church fell silent. Michaels looked startled, but nodded. "The floor is yours, Mr. Harlow." Harlow turned to face the congregation, his expression grave. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the hearing in Cheyenne about justice and what it means, about whether a man who admits to killing 5 people deserves to walk free among God-fearing folk." Margaret felt Elias tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand silently, telling him to wait, to listen. "And I've come to realize," Harlow continued, his voice carrying across the silent church, "that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment. Maybe I should have trusted in the law and in God's plan instead of trying to force my own version of justice." Margaret blinked, certain she'd misheard. Was Samuel Harlow actually apologizing? Mr. Ward, Harlow said, looking directly at Elias, I may not understand everything you've been through. I may not agree with the choices you made, but the judge ruled you're not a criminal, and the Reverend here preaches about forgiveness. So I'm here to say that I was wrong to pursue this matter as far as I did, and I'm sorry for the trouble I caused you and your wife. The silence in the church was absolute. Margaret felt like the world had tilted sideways. This wasn't right. Samuel Harlow didn't apologize, didn't back down. There had to be something more to this. Elias stood slowly, and Margaret could see the weariness in every line of his body. I appreciate you saying that, Mr. Harlow. Takes courage to admit when you're wrong. It does. Harlow smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I hope we can put this all behind us. Move forward as neighbors should. He sat down, and after a moment, Reverend Michaels continued the service, but Margaret couldn't focus on the sermon. Her mind was racing, trying to understand what had just happened. Samuel Harlow didn't give up, didn't forgive, didn't forget. This public apology felt like a trap, but she couldn't see the shape of it yet. After the service, several people approached them to say how glad they were that the conflict was resolved. Clara Morrison even managed a stiff smile and said she hoped they could all be more charitable toward one another. It was surreal, like stepping into an alternate version of Silver Bend, where people were actually kind. On the ride home, Margaret voiced her concerns. That wasn't real. That apology. There's something else going on. I know. Elias kept his eyes on the road. Harlow's planning something. Question is what? They didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, a lawyer from Cheyenne arrived at their ranch with papers. His name was Thornton, and he looked uncomfortable as he explained the situation. Mr. and Mrs. Ward, I've been hired by the Silver Bend Cattlemen's Association to make you an offer for your property. They're willing to pay fair market value plus an additional 20% as an incentive for quick sale. Margaret's blood ran cold. The Cattlemen's Association. You mean Samuel Harlow? Thornton had the grace to look embarrassed. Mr. Harlow is the president of the association. Yes, but this is a legitimate offer, ma'am. They want to consolidate several smaller ranches into a larger operation. Yours is prime grazing land. It's not for sale, Elias said flatly. I understand you may need time to consider. You don't understand. Elias stood, and even though his voice remained calm, there was steel underneath. This land is our home, our future. We're not selling, not for fair market value, not for double, not for any price. Thornton sighed and set the papers on the table. I'll leave these with you anyway. The offer is good for 30 days. After that, he trailed off meaningfully. After that what? Margaret demanded. After that, Harlow tries some other way to force us out. I'm just the messenger, ma'am. I don't know Mr. Harlow's intentions beyond this offer. Thornton tipped his hat and left, leaving the papers behind like a bad omen. Margaret picked them up and read through the details. The offer was generous, she had to admit, more than she could have gotten from anyone else. But it wasn't about the money. It was about Harlow winning, about them being driven from their home by a man who couldn't stand to lose. We're not selling, she said, echoing Elias. Damn right we're not. But over the next week, it became clear that Harlow's public apology had been the opening move in a more subtle campaign. Ranch hands who'd been willing to work for them suddenly found employment elsewhere. Merchants in town started running out of supplies just as Margaret and Elias needed them. The bank sent a letter reminding them that their loan payment was due soon and that any late payment would result in immediate foreclosure. It was economic warfare, quiet and insidious. Harlow was using his influence to strangle them financially without ever directly threatening them. And it was working. By the end of April, Margaret was lying awake at night doing calculations in her head, trying to figure out how they'd survive if things continued this way. We might have to sell, she admitted to Elias one night. Not to Harlow, but maybe to someone else. Somewhere else. Start over fresh, where his influence doesn't reach. Elias was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Remember what you told me in town that day about being tired of bowing down to men like him? About standing beside me instead of being afraid? Yes, but nothing changed, Margaret. We're still us. We still have each other, and we're still not giving him what he wants. Elias turned to face her in the darkness. I've been thinking, Harlow's power comes from other people being afraid of him. But what if we showed them they don't have to be? How? We organize the other small ranchers, the ones who are also struggling, who are also being squeezed by the Cattlemen's Association. We form our own cooperative, pool our resources, negotiate better prices for supplies and cattle, take away Harlow's ability to control the market. Margaret sat up, her mind racing. That could work if we had enough people willing to stand together. Then we find them. We talk to every small rancher, every homesteader who's tired of being pushed around. We show them their strength in numbers. It was risky. If they failed, they'd have made enemies of everyone and lost everything. But if they succeeded, they could change the entire power structure of Silver Bend. Let's do it, Margaret said. They started the next day, riding out to visit the neighboring ranches. The first stop was the Chen family, who owned a small spread east of theirs. Tommy Chen's father, Wei, listened carefully as Elias explained the idea. The Harlows have been squeezing us for years, Wei said in his accented English, always taking more, paying less. But if we fight back, they could destroy us. They're already destroying you, Margaret pointed out gently, just slowly. This way, at least we have a chance. We looked at his son, then back at them. I will think about it. Talk to other families I know, Chinese, Irish, anyone who's been pushed aside. It was the same story at every ranch they visited. People were interested but scared. The Harlows had power, connections, resources. What did a bunch of small ranchers have against that? Each other, Elias kept saying, we have each other. That has to count for something. Slowly, painfully, they built a coalition. The Chens agreed to join. So did the Allies, Irish immigrants who'd been denied loans at the bank. The Johnsons, the Parkers, the Yazzie family. One by one, small ranchers who'd been operating in isolation found common cause. 2 weeks after Thornon's visit, they held their first meeting in the barn at Margaret and Elias's ranch. 15 families showed up, representing nearly a third of the small ranches in the county. They sat on hay bales and fence rails while Elias outlined the plan. We form a cooperative, pull our cattle for sales so we can negotiate better prices, buy supplies in bulk to reduce costs, support each other when the big ranchers try to squeeze us individually. We won't match the Cattlemen's Association in wealth or power, but we can match them in determination. And what happens when Harlow comes after us? Asked Sean Ali, his Irish accent thick. When he uses his bank connections to call in our loans or his political friends to change the laws. Then we document everything, Margaret said, standing beside Elias. We keep records of every attempt to intimidate or coerce. We go to the territorial capital if we have to make noise about corruption and monopolistic practices. The law may favor the rich, but it's not completely blind. We also have something Harlow doesn't. Elias added, we have the moral high ground. We're not trying to drive anyone out or monopolize anything. We're just trying to survive and keep our homes. People respect that. There was a long moment of silence, then Wei Chin stood. I'm in. My family votes yes. Sean Ali stood next. The O'Malley are in. One by one, the families stood, committing themselves to the cooperative. By the end of the meeting, they had 13 of the 15 families on board, with the other 2 promising to decide by week's end. As people were leaving, Doc Morrison's buggy pulled up. The old doctor climbed down with a grim expression. I heard you were organizing. Wanted to warn you that Harlow knows. He's furious. Called an emergency meeting of the Cattlemen's Association tonight. Let him be furious. Margaret said we're not doing anything illegal. No, but he'll make trouble. That man doesn't lose gracefully. Morrison pulled out his medical bag. I also wanted to offer my services to the cooperative. Free medical care for member families. I'm tired of watching good people suffer because they can't afford a doctor. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Doc, you don't have to. I want to consider it my investment in a better Silver Bend. He climbed back into his buggy. Just be careful. Harlow's dangerous when he's cornered. The warning proved prescient. 3 days later, Margaret went to town for supplies and found the atmosphere completely changed. People who'd been warming up to them were cold again. Mr. Henderson barely made eye contact as he filled her order. When she asked what was wrong, he just shook his head. Harlow's been talking. Says you and your husband are stirring up trouble, trying to destroy honest businesses. Says the cooperative is just a front for taking over the county. That's ridiculous. Maybe so, but he's got people scared. Scared folks don't think straight. Margaret left town with a heavy heart and a wagon full of supplies that had cost twice what they should have. The economic pressure was intensifying. At this rate, they'd be broke before summer ended. But that evening, when the cooperative held its second meeting, good news arrived. The two holdout families had agreed to join, and more than that, 3 additional families had asked to be included. The cooperative was growing. We need a name, said something that tells people who we are. They debated various options before Margaret suggested the High Plains Cooperative because we're all trying to reach higher to be more than we are alone. The vote was unanimous. With a name and a plan, the cooperative began to operate. They organized their first joint cattle sale, combining herds to attract buyers from Cheyenne, who normally only dealt with the large ranches. The sale brought in 30% more than any of them would have gotten individually. It was a small victory, but it proved the concept worked. Samuel Harlow's response was swift and harsh. He convinced the bank to call in loans for 3 of the cooperative families. When they couldn't pay immediately, foreclosure proceedings began. The families faced losing everything within 60 days. Margaret was furious. This is illegal. He's using his position on the bank board to target our members. It's legal enough if they actually are behind on payments, Elias said grimly. Even if the timing is suspicious, then we need to help them catch up. The whole point of the cooperative is supporting each other. They organized an emergency meeting. After heated discussion, the members agreed to establish a solidarity fund. Each family would contribute what they could, and the money would be used to help members facing financial emergencies. It wasn't much, but combined with the profits from the joint cattle sale, it was enough to make the first payment for all 3 families in danger of foreclosure. Harlow was livid. He came to the ranch himself, his face red with barely controlled rage. Margaret answered the door with Elias right behind her. "You're making a mistake," Harlow said without preamble. "This cooperative of yours is going to fail, and when it does, you'll have dragged all those families down with you. Or we'll succeed and show everyone that your stranglehold on this county can be broken," Margaret replied calmly. "You don't understand how things work here. The Cattlemen's Association has been running things for 20 years. We bring order, stability, prosperity. You bring control," Elias interrupted. "Control that benefits you and crushes everyone else. Margaret and I know what it's like to be on the outside, to be squeezed until we can barely breathe. We're not going to let you do that to us or anyone else." Harlow's eyes narrowed. "I tried to be reasonable. I offered you a fair price for this land, but you just had to be stubborn. Now you're going to lose everything and you'll have no one to blame but yourselves." "We'd rather lose everything fighting than give up without trying," Margaret said. "Now get off our property." Harlow left, but his parting look promised that this wasn't over. That night, lying in bed, Margaret voiced her deepest fear. What if he's right? What if we're leading all these families to ruin? Elias pulled her close. "Then we'll ruin together." "But Margaret, I don't think we're going to fail." "You know why? Because we have something Harlow doesn't. We have each other's backs. We're building something real, based on mutual support, instead of fear that's stronger than any amount of money or power." "I hope you're right." "I am. You'll see." Over the next month, the cooperative proved itself time and again. When a late frost threatened the Johnson family's crops, cooperative members showed up to help cover the plants and save what they could. When Shauna Ali broke his leg and couldn't work, other members took turns helping his wife with their ranch work. When the Yazzie family's well ran dry, the cooperative pulled resources to dig a new one. And slowly, other small ranchers and farmers began to notice. By mid-June, the High Plains Cooperative had grown to 25 member families. They were becoming a real force in the county, one that couldn't be ignored or easily crushed. The breaking point came in July. The Cattlemen's Association announced they were refusing to do business with any cooperative members. No sales at their auctions, no access to their supply contracts, complete economic isolation. It was meant to be a death blow. Instead, it backfired spectacularly. Elias organized a direct sale to buyers in Cheyenne, cutting out the local middlemen entirely. The cooperative members got better prices for their cattle than they'd ever received through the association. When word spread, more families defected from the Cattlemen's Association to join the cooperative. Samuel Harlow's empire was crumbling, and he knew it. The confrontation came on a Sunday after church. Harlow cornered Margaret and Elias in the churchyard, but this time they weren't alone. 20 families from the cooperative stood with them, a silent wall of support. "You've won," Harlow said bitterly. "I hope you're proud of yourselves." "We're not trying to beat you, Mr. Harlow," Margaret said. "We're just trying to survive. There's room in this county for both the Cattlemen's Association and the High Plains Cooperative." "No, there isn't. You've turned half the county against me, made me look like a tyrant." "You made yourself look like a tyrant," Elias said quietly, "by trying to control everything, by using fear and intimidation. All we did was offer an alternative." Harlow looked at the families surrounding them, and something in his face changed. The anger drained away, replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. "I built this county, brought order when there was only chaos, and this is the thanks I get." "You brought order that served you," Wei Chan said, stepping forward. "Maybe it's time for a different kind of order, one that serves everyone." Harlow was silent for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away. His shoulders slumped in a way they'd never been before. It wasn't quite surrender, but it was acceptance. The old order was changing, and even Samuel Harlow couldn't stop it. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. The Cattlemen's Association and the High Plains Cooperative began tentatively to work together, not as master and servant, but as equals. Joint cattle drives, shared resources, fair negotiations. It wasn't perfect, and there were still tensions, but it was progress. Samuel Harlow never apologized directly to Margaret and Elias, but one day in late summer, a wagon arrived at their ranch loaded with timber. The driver handed Elias a note for your barn repairs. "No charge, consider it a gesture of goodwill." It was signed by Harlow. "Is this his way of saying sorry?" Margaret asked, looking at the quality lumber. "I think it's his way of saying he respects us," Elias replied, "which might be better." They used the lumber to expand the barn, and as they worked, Margaret marveled at how far they'd come. From a desperate widow and a silent mail orderer husband to leaders of a movement that had changed their entire community. It seemed impossible, but here they were, building their future with their own hands. On a warm evening in September, exactly 1 year after Elias had first arrived in Silver Bend, they held a celebration. The entire cooperative gathered at their ranch for a harvest festival. There was music and dancing, food and laughter. Children ran between the adults, while older folks sat and talked about the year's successes. Reverend Michaels said a blessing over the gathering, thanking God for second chances and new beginnings. Doc Morrison proposed a toast to stubborn people who refused to give up. Tommy Chen played a fiddle he'd been learning, the notes bright and cheerful. As the sun began to set, Elias pulled out his harmonica. But instead of playing alone, Wei-Chin joined him with a flute, and Shauna Ali added his voice, singing an old Irish tune about home and belonging. The music filled the evening air, weaving through conversations and laughter, binding them all together. Margaret stood watching, her heart so full it hurt. This was what they'd built. Not just a cooperative or an economic alliance, but a community, a real one based on mutual respect and support. Elias found her in the crowd and pulled her close. "What are you thinking about?" "About how a year ago I was standing at that train platform, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Wondering if I'd invited a stranger into my life who'd make everything worse. And now I know I didn't invite a stranger. I invited my future, my partner, my home." She looked up at him, this man who'd been so silent for so long until the moment he needed to speak. "You saved me, Elias. Not just the ranch, but me. You gave me back my strength. We saved each other," he said, echoing the words she'd spoken all those months ago in Cheyenne. "And we're going to keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." They danced then, moving slowly to the music, holding each other as stars began to appear overhead. Around them, other couples joined in, and soon the yard was full of people dancing, celebrating, living. Clara Morrison approached during a pause in the music, her husband at her side. She looked uncomfortable but determined. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. I was cruel when you needed kindness. I judged when I should have supported. I'm sorry." Margaret was so surprised she almost didn't know what to say. "I appreciate that, Clara. Thank you. Your husband is a good man. I can see that now. And you two have done something remarkable here." Clara gestured at the gathering. "You've shown us all what's possible when people work together instead of tearing each other down." It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start, and that was enough. As the evening wore on and people began to leave, calling out farewells and promises to see each other soon, Margaret and Elias stood on their porch, watching the wagons roll away into the darkness. "We should think about expanding the house," Elias said. Suddenly, Margaret looked at him. "Why?" "Because we're going to need more room for the children we'll have, for the life we're building." He pulled her close, his hand resting on her stomach, in a gesture that was both tender and hopeful. "Unless you don't want." "I want," Margaret said quickly. "I want everything with you. Children, a bigger house, a future so bright it hurts to look at. All of it. Then that's what we'll build together." They went inside, and that night they made love with the windows open, letting in the cool September air and the sounds of their land settling into darkness. Afterward, Elias held Margaret close and told her about his dreams for their future. A son they could name James after the boy he'd lost. A daughter with Margaret's strength and determination. A house full of laughter instead of silence. A life rich with meaning and connection. "I never thought I'd get this," he said quietly. "After Kansas, after everything, I thought the best I could hope for was survival. But you gave me more than that. You gave me joy." "You gave it to me too," Margaret whispered. "I was just surviving before you came, going through motions, keeping my head above water. You taught me how to really live again." "We're quite a pair," Elias said with a soft laugh. "Two broken people who put each other back together. The best kind of pair." Fall deepened into winter, and with it came news that Margaret was indeed pregnant. Elias wept when she told him. Tears of joy mixed with grief for the family he'd lost and hope for the family they were creating. He was gentle with her as her belly grew, almost comically protective, making her laugh with his constant worry. "I'm not fragile," she insisted one day when he tried to stop her from lifting a feed bucket. "I know, but I'm allowed to take care of you. Let me have this." So she did, letting him fuss and worry and love her with an intensity that sometimes took her breath away. This man who'd been so silent, so careful with his emotions, now wore his heart openly. He talked to her belly at night, telling their unborn child stories about his own childhood, about Margaret's courage, about the community they'd built together. The baby was born on a warm May morning, 13 months after the harvest festival. It was a daughter, healthy and loud, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same storm grey as her father's. They named her Sarah Margaret Ward, honoring both Elias's first wife and Margaret's strength. When Elias held his daughter for the first time, he broke down completely, sobbing against Margaret's shoulder while the baby slept peacefully in his arms. "I don't deserve this," he kept saying. "I don't deserve another chance." "Yes, you do," Margaret said firmly, exhausted but happy. "You've earned it. Every day for the past 2 years you've earned it." The cooperative families brought gifts and food, helping with the ranch work while Margaret recovered. Wei Chen's wife, Lin, came every day to help with the baby, teaching Margaret songs in Chinese to sing to Sarah. Doc Morrison checked on them regularly, refusing payment and insisting it was his privilege to care for them. Even Samuel Harlow sent a gift, a beautiful cradle he'd made himself from oak. The note attached simply said, "For new beginnings." As summer arrived and Sarah grew stronger, Margaret would sit on the porch with her daughter in her arms, watching Elias work the land that was truly theirs now. All debts paid, all threats vanquished. Sometimes he'd look up and catch her watching, and the smile that spread across his face was everything. On a Sunday in June, they stood before the congregation at church as Reverend Michaels blessed Sarah. The church was packed with cooperative families and others from town, all there to celebrate this new life. As the Reverend spoke about hope and redemption and God's grace, Margaret caught Elias's eye and saw her own joy reflected back at her. After the service, they gathered at the ranch for another celebration, smaller than the harvest festival, but no less joyful. People took turns holding Sarah, cooping over her, predicting what she'd become. Tommy Chen, now 15 and working as an apprentice at the Mercantile, declared she'd be the first female governor of Wyoming Territory. Everyone laughed, but Margaret thought maybe he wasn't wrong. Her daughter would grow up in a world where women fought for what they wanted and won. A world where second chances were possible and love could triumph over fear. As evening fell and people began to leave, Elias brought out his harmonica. But this time, the melody he played was pure joy. No trace of the old sorrow that had marked his music for so long. He played for Sarah, for Margaret, for the life they'd built, from loneliness and loss. Wei-chan joined him again with his flute, and together they created something beautiful, a song that spoke of journeys ended and new ones beginning. Margaret swayed with Sarah in her arms, humming along, feeling utterly content. When everyone had finally gone and the three of them were alone under the stars, Elias set down his harmonica and wrapped his arms around Margaret and their daughter. "I love you," he said, his voice full and strong, no longer rationed or careful. "I love you both more than I thought it was possible to love anything. You're my world, my reason, my everything." "We love you too," Margaret said, kissing him softly. "Thank you for answering my advertisement all those months ago. Thank you for being too quiet until the moment that mattered. Thank you for showing me what real love looks like. Thank you for fighting for me, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself, for giving me this." He looked down at Sarah, who was sleeping peacefully between them, for giving me everything. They stood like that for a long time, three people bound together by love and choice and determination. The Wyoming wind sang through the grass, carrying the scent of summer hay and wildflowers. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed softly. The world kept turning, indifferent to their happiness, but they'd carved out this space, this life, this home that was uniquely theirs. Margaret looked out over the land she'd fought so hard to keep, the land that represented not just survival, but triumph. She thought about the desperate widow she'd been, placing an advertisement for a husband like she'd order a plough, and the strong woman she'd become through loving and being loved by the quiet man beside her. She thought about Elias arriving at that train platform 2 years ago with all his possessions in a single bag and so much grief in his heart, he could barely speak. The way he'd slowly, carefully learned to trust again, to hope again, to live again. The way he'd defended her when words were finally necessary, breaking his silence to protect what mattered most. And she thought about Sarah, this tiny miracle, sleeping peacefully, unaware that she represented the future they'd fought so hard to secure. A future where love triumphed over hatred, where community defeated isolation, where broken people could heal and build something beautiful from the pieces. "It's perfect," Margaret whispered. "All of it. Perfectly imperfect." "Just like us," Elias agreed, and in his voice she heard everything they'd survived and everything they'd become. Two people who'd found each other in the loneliest places and refused to let go. No matter how hard the world tried to tear them apart, they went inside together, carrying their daughter, carrying their hope, carrying their love. And in the morning they'd wake and do it all again, building their life one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of courage at a time, because that's what love was in the end. Not the absence of fear or struggle or pain, but the choice to keep fighting through all of it. The choice to believe in second chances. The choice to speak when silence would be easier. To stand when falling would be simpler. To love when giving up would be safer. Margaret laid Sarah in her cradle, the one Samuel Harlow had made, and stood for a moment watching her daughter sleep. Elias came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "That I'm grateful for all of it, the struggle, the fear, even the pain, because it brought us here to this moment, to this life. And I wouldn't trade a single second of it." "Neither would I," Elias said, "not 1 second." They stayed like that, holding each other in the darkness, listening to their daughter breathe, feeling the solid reality of the home they'd built together. Outside, the Wyoming night stretched vast and endless, full of stars and possibility. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the high plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, The Ward family would wake together and face another day. Another chance to love, to work, to build, to live. Another opportunity to show the world that second chances were real. That love could conquer fear, that a mail-order husband who'd been too quiet could find his voice, exactly when it mattered most. Their story would become legend in Silverbend. People would tell it for generations. The tale of the widow who gambled on a stranger and the silent man who defended her honor. They'd embellish parts, get details wrong, but the heart of it would remain true. Love, when real and fought for, could transform everything. But for Margaret and Elias, it was never a legend. It was simply their life, precious and hard-won and entirely their own. And that was more than enough.